Ilara Voss had exactly 14 days to ruin her life before someone else did it for her. She stood at the window of her bedroom on the second floor of the Voss estate, looking out at the gray autumn fields that stretched toward the village of Aldermere. The hedgerows had gone brown. The oak at the edge of the south field had dropped most of its leaves, and they lay across the ground in wet clumps that no one had bothered to rake. The estate had looked like this for 2 years now. Not broken, exactly, but tired. Tired in the way that things get tired when the money stops arriving, and the repairs stop happening, and everyone quietly pretends not to notice. Her father's voice was still carrying up through the floorboards. She could not make out the words anymore, but she did not need to. She had heard them clearly enough 20 minutes ago, when he had called her into his study and told her, with the steady calm of a man who had already made his decision and merely wanted her to receive it, that Lord Harwick had expressed a formal interest in her hand, that negotiations were already underway, and that the marriage would resolve the estate's outstanding debts in a single transaction. That was the word he used, transaction. Ilara pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and watched her own breath fog it. Lord Harwick was 51 years old. She had met him twice, once at a county dinner 3 years ago, when she was 20, and he was a recent widower, still wearing his grief like a coat he had not decided whether to keep, and once at a charity event, the following spring, when it became clear he had decided to keep the coat, but have it altered to fit him more comfortably. He was not a cruel man, from what she had observed. He was something she found harder to bear than cruelty. He was indifferent. He moved through rooms the way very wealthy, very settled men do, without particular interest in what or who was already there, focused only on what he intended to add or remove. His first wife had given him no children before she died. He needed an heir. He needed a household manager. He needed someone young enough and healthy enough to fulfill both requirements without inconvenience. He did not, as far as Ilara could determine, need a person. She turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of her bed. Her room was the one corner of the estate that still felt like something that belonged to her. The bookshelves were full, proper full, with volumes tucked horizontally on top of upright ones, because she had run out of space 3 years ago and simply kept acquiring books. There was a writing desk near the window, with a stack of her mother's journals on one corner, tied together with a piece of brown ribbon that had once been blue. There was a small lamp she kept burning, later than was considered sensible by anyone in the household. On the floor near the wardrobe was a basket of correspondence, letters from a women's literary society in London, with whom she exchanged essays and reading recommendations, and, occasionally, arguments about philosophy. Her mother had published essays under a pen name. Her mother had believed, with a quiet and unmovable certainty, that women's minds were not secondary instruments but primary ones, and that the only thing society had done was make women afraid to use them fully and openly. Her mother had died 4 years ago, and Ilara had been carrying that belief like a debt she intended to repay. She could not repay it from Lord Harwick's estate. She picked up one of her mother's journals and held it without opening it. She had read every page so many times that she no longer needed to read them to know what was inside. She just held it sometimes. It helped her think. The problem was not that marriage itself was impossible to contemplate. Ilara was not opposed to the idea of a life shared with someone. The problem was the nature of the arrangement her father had described. This was not the beginning of something. This was the closing of an account. She was the settlement. She was what got handed over when the numbers did not balance. And once handed over, she would not come back. She set the journal down and stood up again. 14 days. That was what her father had said. Lord Harwick would make his formal visit in a fortnight, and after that, things would move quickly. There would be a betrothal announcement. There would be a date set. The books would be balanced, and she would belong to a man who needed her the way someone needs a piece of furniture, present, functional, and unremarkable. She walked to her writing desk and sat down. She did not pick up a pen. She folded her hands on the surface and looked at the grain of the wood and thought as hard as she had ever thought about anything. What could stop it? Illness, possibly. But illness could be waited out, and her father's patience, when money was involved, was considerable. A scandal could stop it, but a scandal attached to her name would hurt no one more than herself, and Lord Harwick could simply withdraw without consequence while she was left with nothing. Running away was a fantasy that only worked in novels, where the heroine had funds, and a friend in another city willing to open their door, and Ilara had neither in sufficient quantity. She sat very still for a long time. The lamp on her desk guttered slightly in a draught from somewhere. She looked at the flame. Then she thought of her mother's friend, Mrs. Pendleton. Mrs. Pendleton had come to stay with them the summer Ilara was 16. She had lost her sight gradually over 2 years, due to an illness that the doctors had named in long Latin terms that added up to, "We cannot help her." She was a remarkable woman, practical, precise, even funny, and she had visited for 3 weeks, and in that time, Ilara had watched her constantly, with the focused attention of someone learning a language. How Mrs. Pendleton moved through unfamiliar rooms. How she kept her hands low and slightly forward. How she turned her face toward a sound a moment before she turned her body. How she poured tea without spilling it. How she did not turn her head to look at something that caught her attention, because nothing caught her attention visually anymore. How her eyes, open and clear, and perfectly intact, focused on nothing, with a particular quality of unfocus, that was not vacancy, but something more interior. A person looking at what was inside, rather than outside. Ilara had not thought of Mrs. Pendleton in years. She thought of her now, with a clarity that made her fingers go still on the desk. It was the most dangerous idea she had ever had. It was also, she realized, the only idea she had that had any chance at all. She sat with it for an hour. She turned it around in her mind, and looked at every side of it, the way her mother had taught her to examine arguments, before accepting or rejecting them. She looked for the places it could fail. She looked for the people it would affect. She thought about what it would require of her, not just the performance itself, but the maintenance of it, the discipline, the absolute consistency without which the whole thing would collapse. She thought about what it would cost her if it worked. She thought about what it would cost her if it did not. Then she thought about Lord Harwick's estate, and the room she would be given in it, and the life she would live in that room, and what she would not be doing in that life, and what she would not become. She opened her writing desk drawer, and took out a fresh sheet of paper. Dr. Aldrich Moore was 28 years old, and had been the Voss family physician for less than a year. He had taken the position because the previous physician had retired abruptly after a dispute with Ilara's father over an unpaid bill, and because the village of Aldermere was not the kind of posting that drew ambitious young doctors from the cities. He was not ambitious in the conventional sense. He was thoughtful, careful, somewhat serious, and he had a strong distaste for dishonesty that he was aware of, and also knew had flexible edges in certain circumstances. He had, in his first months at the estate, come to regard Ilara Voss with a particular kind of respect. She was one of the most genuinely curious people he had met. She asked him real questions about medicine when they spoke. Not polite questions designed to fill silence, but questions that suggested she had been thinking about the subject, and had reached a point where she needed outside information to go further. He had lent her 2 medical texts. She had returned them, with careful penciled notes in the margins, that had made him stop and reconsider a few things he thought he already understood. When her letter arrived, asking him to come to the estate on a matter of some urgency and discretion, he went. She told him everything. She sat across from him at the small table in her mother's old sitting room, and explained the situation plainly and completely, without softening it or dramatizing it. She told him about her father's arrangement. She told him about Lord Harwick. She told him what she intended to do, and what she needed from him. She held his gaze throughout. She did not apologize for asking. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "What you are describing," he said at last, "is asking me to provide a false medical record." "Yes," she said. "That could end my career." "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to do it for nothing. I am asking you to do it because I have no other path, and you are the only person in this house who might understand why that matters." He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at the stack of his own medical texts on the shelf behind her, the ones she had returned with those careful penciled notes. "How long would you need?" he asked. "Long enough for Lord Harwick to withdraw," she said. "After that, I cannot say. But I will not ask you to sustain it indefinitely. If there comes a moment where it creates more risk for you than it does benefit for me, I will find a way to recover. I will say the sight returned. Physicians have seen stranger things." He thought for another long moment. "I would need to document it in a way that is technically defensible," he said slowly. A sudden onset with no clear physical cause. There are precedents, documented cases of functional blindness following severe emotional disturbance. It is rare, but it is real. If anyone looks closely, it would hold at the surface level. Alara was quiet. Then she said, "Is that a yes?" "It is," he said, and looked as though he was not entirely sure whether he would regret it. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Alara practiced in her room for hours at a time. She moved through the space with her eyes open but unfocused, letting the shapes and colors of the room register at the edge of perception, rather than at its center. She practiced keeping her hands slightly forward and slightly low. She practiced her stillness, the specific quality of stillness that is not blankness but interiority, the look of a person whose attention has moved somewhere other than outward. She stood in front of her mirror and worked until her own reflection looked back at her, with eyes that were present but not seeing. She made one mistake on the second day. She was walking through the upstairs hallway, and she heard a door open behind her, and she turned toward it automatically, fully and directly. Before she remembered, she stopped. She stood still for a moment, then turned her face away, and continued walking. The door had been opened by Mary, the youngest housemaid, who had not appeared to notice anything. Alara stood in her room afterward, and gripped the bedpost, and told herself that one mistake of that kind, in front of the wrong person, would end everything. She did not make that mistake again. Her father was informed 4 days before Lord Harwick's visit that Alara had suffered a sudden and distressing loss of vision. Dr. Moore delivered the news in person, with clinical gravity and a written documentation of the onset and his assessment of the prognosis. Her father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, a calculating pause, and then something that Alara, watching carefully from behind her performance, recognized as the look of a man trying to find the angle that still worked in his favor. She watched him, and felt the cold, clear knowledge that she had been right to be afraid of this arrangement. A man who, on hearing that his daughter had lost her sight, stopped not to feel something but to calculate. That man would not have protected her in any household, including his own. Lord Harwick's visit arrived. Alara descended the stairs on the arm of her maid, moving slowly, one hand extended slightly at her side. She wore a simple gray dress. She did not wear the veil she had considered. Too theatrical, she had decided. The power of the performance was in its restraint. She sat in the drawing room and held her hands in her lap and kept her face directed at a point slightly above and to the left of where Lord Harwick sat. She heard the weight of his breathing. She heard the way his chair shifted. She did not turn toward either of these sounds, though every instinct she had said to look, to locate, to read the room. She breathed slowly and looked at the middle distance and waited. Lord Harwick's voice was heavier than she remembered it. He asked, with a correctness that had no warmth beneath it, how she was managing. She answered quietly that she was learning to manage. She answered a few more questions in the same quiet, careful way. She did not offer more than what was asked. She did not perform distress. She simply was, still, present, and unavailable to the life he had come to arrange. He stayed for 40 minutes. He spoke with her father privately after. The sound of their conversation did not reach her where she waited in the drawing room. Sitting with her hands folded over a book she appeared to be unable to read. He left before dinner. Her father came into the drawing room afterward and stood near the fireplace. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was careful and controlled, that Lord Harwick had expressed his regrets and would not be proceeding with the arrangement. Alara said nothing. She kept her face directed at the middle distance. "He needs a wife who can manage a household," her father said. There was something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was, she thought, mostly frustration at a transaction that had failed to close. "I understand," she said. She sat in the drawing room for another half an hour after he left. She kept perfectly still. She listened to the fire. Outside the window, the last light was going out of the autumn afternoon, and the fields beyond the glass were becoming shapes and shadows, and then just darkness. She had done it. She had held the line. But sitting there, in the quiet drawing room, with the fire going low and the dark coming on outside, she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief. She felt the first awareness of what she had set in motion, not what she had escaped, what she had entered. The deception was not finished. It had not ended with Lord Harwick's departure. It had, in fact, just begun. And there was no clean moment she could point to, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, when she could simply stop. She pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed. 14 days. She had done it in 14 days. And now the real test was not the performance she had given today. The real test was the one that had no end date, and no clear limit, and no audience she could study in advance. She had bought herself time. She did not yet know what it would cost. The letter arrived on a Thursday, and Alara almost reached out and took it from the tray, before remembering that she was not supposed to see it. She pulled her hand back. She kept her face still. Mary, who had brought the tray in, set it on the side table and said, "There is a letter come, Miss Alara. Shall I read it to you?" "Later," Alara said. "Leave it there." After Mary left, Alara sat in the chair by the window for a full 5 minutes, listening for footsteps in the hallway, before she rose and went to the tray and picked up the letter. It was from the London Literary Society, and it contained 3 pages of handwritten commentary on an essay she had submitted the previous month, an essay about her mother's writings and the tradition of women publishing under false names. The commentary was sharp and thorough, and there was a note at the bottom from the Society's director, a woman named Clara Finch, saying they would very much like to publish the essay in their quarterly journal if Alara was willing. She stood at the side table and read every word twice. Then she folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her sleeve, and returned to her chair by the window. This was how her new life worked. It was now 6 weeks since Lord Harwick had left the estate without a betrothal. 6 weeks since her father had stood at the fireplace and told her, in a carefully neutral voice, that the arrangement had not proceeded. 6 weeks of Alara performing, every single day, in front of everyone in the household. The servants, her father, the occasional visitor, the careful and unwavering portrait of a woman who could not see. And in those 6 weeks, something unexpected had happened. She had found room. Her father, who had spent the 2 years before this manufacturing reasons why Alara needed to be in certain places at certain times, and needed to present herself in certain ways, and needed to be available for inspection at short notice, had stopped doing all of that. Not out of compassion exactly, though there was perhaps some element of guilt in it that he would not have named. He had stopped because the machinery of his plans for her required a daughter who was marriageable, and she no longer was. She had become, in the accounting of his ambitions, a closed account. Still a member of the household, still his daughter, but no longer an asset he could deploy. The consequence of becoming undeployable was that she was largely left alone. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, enormous. She could stay in her room until 10 in the morning, without anyone requiring her presence at breakfast. She could spend the afternoon at her writing desk, without anyone sending a servant to remind her that she was expected to be available. She could receive her correspondence and deal with it on her own terms, provided she did so in the privacy of her room. She could read until the lamp ran low without anyone telling her it was not appropriate. The social calls dried up almost entirely within the first 3 weeks. Word traveled fast in a county as small as Aldermere, and once the story circulated, poor Miss Alara Voss, struck blind so suddenly, what a tragedy. The nature of the calls shifted from the slightly predatory assessment visits that had characterized the previous year, during which various households had sent daughters to size her up as competition, and mothers to evaluate her prospects as a match for their sons, to something more like sympathy visits that Alara found considerably easier to manage. People came to sit with her briefly, to offer kind words, to bring small gifts. They did not expect much from her. They expected her to be quiet and present and grateful. She was all 3 of those things, with her eyes directed at the appropriate middle distance, and they went away satisfied and did not come back too soon. Dr. Moore came twice a week. These visits were conducted with absolute professionalism in the presence of any household members who might observe them, and with considerably more relaxed conversation when they were certain of privacy. He would examine her eyes, genuinely, carefully, out of what she understood was both professional thoroughness and a kind of ongoing astonishment at what she was sustaining, and then they would speak quietly about whatever she had been reading, or about what was happening in the world outside the estate, or about the medical curiosities he encountered in his practice that he thought she would find interesting. He never asked her to stop, she never expected him to. But she could see, in the way he held himself when he was being careful, that he was maintaining his own version of a performance. the competent doctor who had documented and was monitoring a genuine condition, and that it cost him something. She wanted to acknowledge this, but did not know how to do it without making it worse. So she kept the visits useful to him when she could, asked him real questions, gave him the respect of genuine engagement, and hoped that counted for something. The essay for the Literary Society was not the first thing she had written since the deception began. She had been writing steadily since she was 17, mostly essays and criticism, occasionally correspondence that functioned as a kind of extended intellectual argument across several months. Her mother had taught her to write the way some people teach their children to play instruments, not as a skill to be added on top of everything else, but as the primary tool, the thing by which she organized and tested her thinking. She wrote under her mother's pen name, E. Moreland. No one at the estate knew this. Her father did not read literary journals. The servants could not have known. The correspondence came addressed to E. Moreland, care of a post office box she had arranged in the village, and the replies went out the same way, carried to the village by Mary on her regular supply runs. Mary was the one person in the household who knew something was not entirely right. Elara had understood this from the beginning, and had factored it into her management of the situation. Mary was 18 years old, had been with the household for 3 years, and was the kind of person whose fundamental decency was evident even in small things. The way she always knocked twice before entering. The way she said, "Miss Elara," with a particular careful softness after the blindness was announced, as though calibrating her voice to be sure it landed gently. Mary had noticed, early on, that Elara seemed sometimes to know where things were in the room before anyone described their location. Mary had said nothing, but her eyes, when Elara sometimes caught a flicker of her face at the edge of her peripheral vision, held a question that was permanently waiting for an answer. Elara had made a careful decision about Mary. She would not lie to her directly. She would not confirm anything, and she would not deny anything. But she would not construct false evidence for Mary's benefit, the way she did for everyone else. If Mary eventually worked it out, Elara did not intend to be the person who had looked her in the face and told her something false. She suspected Mary would work it out. She also suspected Mary would not say anything when she did. Some people are loyal in that way, not because they owe you loyalty, but because they are that kind of person, and there is nothing you did to earn it, and nothing you can do to take it from them. October moved into November. The estate felt quieter than it had the year before, which had felt quieter than the year before that. Her father spent increasing amounts of time at his club in the county seat, which was either a sign that he was working on the debt problem through his own channels, or a sign that he was avoiding the estate, and everything it currently represented. Elara did not inquire. She welcomed his absences the way a person in a small room welcomes an open window. She finished the essay she owed the Literary Society, rewrote 2 sections, and sent it out through Mary, without reading her the contents. She began a second essay about the architecture of women's education, not the formal institutional kind, which barely existed, but the informal kind, the kind her mother had practiced and passed on, the kind that happened through books, passed between friends, and letters exchanged in confidence, and conversations held in rooms where the men had briefly left. She was halfway through the second essay when her sister, Frances, came to visit. Frances was 4 years older than Elara, and had married at 20 into a household that was, by most measures available to county society, a success. Her husband, George Hartley, was a pleasant man, with a good income, and no remarkable qualities in either direction. Frances had organized her life around those 2 facts, and appeared, from the outside, entirely settled. She moved through the world with the air of someone who had finished one large task, and was patiently waiting for the next one to announce itself. She had visited once, in the weeks immediately following Lord Harwick's withdrawal, and that visit had been brief and formal, and conducted entirely in the code that sisters who have not spoken honestly in several years use when they want to check on each other, without acknowledging that they are checking. She had looked at Elara, looked at her with a particular attention, and then looked away, and they had spoken about the weather, and the garden, and a mutual acquaintance who had recently moved to Scotland. This second visit was different. Frances arrived on a Tuesday morning when their father was away, and she sat down across from Elara in the sitting room with the particular posture of someone who has decided, on the drive over, to be more direct than they usually allow themselves to be. "You seem well," she said. "I am managing," Elara said. "You seem very well." Francis said. Particularly so. Ilara kept her face toward the window. The fresh air in the mornings helps, she said. A silence, the kind that has something sitting inside it. Ilara, Francis said, and then she stopped, and then she said, more quietly, you do not need to explain anything to me. Ilara was very still. I only want to say, Francis continued, and her voice had changed, had lost the careful county society surface, and become something else underneath, something older, and more tired, and more honest. That I know what it is to look at something coming toward you, and not be able to turn away from it. And I know what it is to wish, very much, that you could. She paused. I did not find a way to turn away, she said. I do not know if you have found one. I am not asking. I am only saying that whatever it is, I hope it is working. Ilara kept her face directed at the window. She kept her hands perfectly still in her lap. She breathed. Thank you, she said, after a long moment. Francis stayed for 2 hours, and they spoke about nothing of consequence. When she left, Ilara sat for a while in the empty sitting room. The fire had gone low. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that painted a long stripe across the floor and across the arm of the chair across from her. She looked at it. Just looked at it, openly, without the performance, because she was alone, and for a moment she let herself just be alone, in a room, in the ordinary way. A person with eyes that worked, and a mind that was turning things over. Her sister knew, or suspected, or had decided not to ask. The question was not who else might know. The question was how long she could hold the thing, at exactly the right tension, firm enough that it didn't come apart, loose enough that it didn't snap. She had been at it for 6 weeks. It felt both longer and shorter than that. Some days the performance was so much a part of how she moved through the world that she almost forgot it was a performance. Those were the days that frightened her most, not because she was losing track of what was real, but because she could see how a person could. How you could build something so thoroughly into your life that it stopped feeling like a construction and started feeling like a fact. She did not want that. She wanted to remain clear-eyed about what she was doing, even if what she was doing required her to appear otherwise. She went back to her room and picked up the essay she had been writing. She read what she had so far and found that it was good, sharper than she usually allowed herself to be, more direct, less careful. The deception had done something to her writing. It had loosened something, perhaps because she was spending so much of her daily energy on restraint and control. When she sat down to write, she let herself have the opposite, let herself be unguarded on the page in ways she had not quite managed before. She wrote until the lamp needed refilling, then she refilled it and wrote some more. In December, the first of the new marriage inquiries arrived. She had not anticipated this. She had assumed that the news of her condition would function as it had with Lord Harwick, as a quiet, efficient deterrent that closed a door without requiring a confrontation. She had not accounted for the subset of county society, for whom a woman with a significant disability and a reasonable family name and no immediate prospects represented not a closed door, but an opportunity of a different kind. 3 letters came in December, one from a family in the next county whose son was known to have difficulties of his own that made him, in the careful language of county politics, not an entirely straightforward match. One from a family seeking to reduce their settlement expectations, which her condition theoretically allowed. And one that was simply, as far as she could tell, from a man who was lonely and had decided that a blind wife would be easier to manage. Her father responded to the first 2 with non-committal replies that kept his options open. He did not tell Ilara about them. She found out through Mary, who had overheard enough of a conversation in the hallway to piece together the broad shape of what was being discussed. Ilara sat with this information for a day and understood that the door she had closed on Lord Harwick had not closed on the category of problem he represented. Her father was not done. He was simply resorting the options, looking for the arrangement that still worked with the materials currently available to him. She was still a transaction. The terms had changed. The fundamental accounting had not. She went back to her desk. She wrote the rest of the essay. She sent it out. She received a reply from Clara Finch saying it was the strongest piece they had received that quarter and asking whether E. Moreland had more work in progress. She wrote back and said yes. She always had more work in progress. That was the thing about the room she had found inside this strange and dangerous arrangement she had made. No one was coming to take her out of it for reasons they thought were good for her. No one was organizing her time for her benefit and calling it management. No one was positioning her like a piece on a board and calling it love. She was here, in this room, with her mind fully employed, doing work that mattered to her, with no one requiring her to stop. The cost of it was real. She knew that. Every day was a performance. Every interaction carried risk. Every new inquiry her father entertained was a reminder that the problem had not been solved, only delayed. But she was not done yet, and she was not going to be. By the time the second year began, Ilara had stopped counting days. In the early months of the deception, she had kept a kind of mental tally without meaning to, the way people do when they are waiting for something to end. 40 days, 60, 100. But somewhere in the middle of the first winter, she had lost track of the count, and by the time spring came, she had stopped looking for the number entirely. The deception had stopped being a temporary construction and become something more like weather, something she moved through, rather than something she maintained. This should have been a warning. She understood that now, looking back. The moment something dangerous stops feeling dangerous is the moment it becomes most dangerous. But in the living of it, the change did not announce itself. It crept in the way early morning creeps in, gradually, then all at once. The household had adjusted. That was the simplest way to describe what had happened. The servants moved differently around her, not with the exaggerated care that had characterized the first weeks, when everyone was still feeling the shape of the new arrangement and tending toward over-solicitousness that required considerable patience on Ilara's part to receive without reacting. Now they moved with a practiced ease, leaving things in predictable places, announcing themselves briefly before coming into rooms where she was sitting, keeping the furniture in consistent positions so she could navigate reliably. Mary had appointed herself the unofficial manager of this adjustment, and she had done it quietly and thoroughly, without fanfare, the way competent people do things. It was Mary who also managed the mail, without ever being asked explicitly to do so, in a way that required anyone to name what they were really doing. She sorted the correspondence, read out the items that required response from Ilara's father, and brought the items addressed to E. Moreland, which arrived, as far as anyone else knew, addressed to an old friend of her mother's whom Ilara was corresponding with on behalf of the estate, directly to Ilara's room. 2 more essays had been published in the quarterly journal. A third was under consideration. The letters from Clara Finch had become longer and more personal, the careful professional distance of the early exchanges giving way to something that felt more like friendship, the kind of friendship that exists almost entirely on the page, between people who may never meet, that can somehow be more honest than the friendships made in rooms. Clara Finch had written, in her most recent letter, that E. Moreland's voice was unlike anything else the journal was currently publishing. She had written that the essays felt like someone thinking out loud, not performing thought, but actually doing it, in real time, on the page. She had asked if E. Moreland would be willing to write something longer, a full monograph perhaps, something that could be published properly, not just in the quarterly. Ilara had held that letter for a long time. A monograph meant commitment. It meant sustained work over a period of months. It meant, in some sense, declaring that this life she had built inside the deception, this writing life, this thinking life, was not temporary, was not just what she was doing while she waited for things to change. She wrote back to Clara and said yes. The second year also brought changes to the estate situation that Ilara tracked carefully and quietly through the information that circulated around her in the normal course of household life. Her father's club visits had become more frequent and longer. The bills from the house accounts, which Ilara had taken over managing on the quiet grounds that she could do it by feel and memory, and that her father, left to do it himself, made mistakes that cost more than they saved, showed that certain previously reliable income streams from the estate's tenant farms had grown inconsistent. A boundary dispute with a neighboring property over a shared drainage channel had required the involvement of a solicitor and had gone on for more than 6 months without resolution. But it was tired in the way it had been tired before, that particular tiredness of a house that is maintained but not invested in, that is managed for the short term because the long term feels too uncertain. Her father had not mentioned marriage to her directly, since the December inquiries had come to nothing. He mentioned it around her, the way people mention things in the presence of someone they have decided probably cannot hear everything, slightly too loud, slightly too casual, slightly too curated. She was present for 2 conversations that he apparently intended her to overhear, both of which concerned hypothetical arrangements in general terms. She listened without moving. She had become very good at listening. This was perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the year she had spent not visibly looking at things. Her hearing had sharpened, not literally, not physically, but in terms of attention. When you stop tracking rooms visually, when the constant low-level processing of faces and expressions and body language was removed from the top layer of your awareness, something else moved up to take its place. You heard the weight behind a sentence. You heard the pause before an answer. You heard the difference between a voice that was saying something and a voice that was performing something. You heard what people were trying to say and what they were saying instead. She had been listening to her father in this sharpened way for a year. What she heard was a man who was frightened, though he would never name it that way. A man who had organized his world around a particular set of assumptions about what he was owed, and what he could arrange, and how things were supposed to resolve themselves, and who was finding, with increasing frequency, that the world was not performing as expected. He was not a bad man. She had decided this, after a long period of thinking about it with more detachment than she had previously managed. He was not a bad man. He was a limited one. He had a narrow set of tools, and he applied them to every problem. And when a problem would not yield to those tools, he became frightened, and the fear came out sideways, as anger, or as manipulation, or as the particular kind of deliberate unawareness that allows a person to treat another person as a means rather than an end. Understanding this did not change what he had tried to do. It did not make the Lord Harwick arrangement easier to look at, but it made it something she could think about clearly, without the heat of it distorting everything else. In early spring, her friend from the Literary Society came to visit. This was unexpected. Clara Finch had mentioned, in her last letter, that she would be traveling to the north of the county to spend a fortnight with her brother, and she had asked, with careful delicacy, whether it might be possible to call on E. Moreland during that time. She had expressed, with equal delicacy, that she understood if it was not convenient or comfortable given the circumstances, and that she would entirely understand a decline. Elara had read this letter 3 times. Then she had written back and said that a visit would be very welcome, and that she should come on a Thursday, when her father was typically away. The problem was immediate and obvious, and she had spent 2 weeks working through it. Clara Finch believed she was corresponding with a blind woman. She had never expressed this belief explicitly, because the circumstance of the blindness was not something that came up frequently in letters about literature and philosophy. But she would arrive expecting a blind woman. She would have calibrated herself for it, would have prepared the particular kind of careful, unassuming consideration that kind people bring to those circumstances. And Elara would have to receive that and sustain the performance with someone who was, in a real sense, a friend, someone whose respect she had earned honestly through her work, someone whose good opinion she valued in a way that she valued few people's good opinions. She told herself it was just another performance. She told herself she had maintained the thing in front of everyone in the household every day for a year. She told herself Clara Finch was not going to be more observant than the people she navigated daily. She was right about all of that, but she had not accounted for how it would feel. Clara Finch arrived on a Thursday, as arranged, and was shown into the sitting room where Elara was already positioned. Clara was 42, older than Elara had expected from the letters, though there was no reason she should have had any particular expectation. She was a compact, precise woman, with gray beginning at her temples, and the kind of steadiness in her movement that comes from decades of having organized things, and having them generally organized in return. She shook Elara's hand warmly, using both of hers, and sat down, and began talking in the same voice she used in her letters, direct, engaged, without the particular softening around the edges that some people applied when they were managing what they thought was a delicate situation. Elara liked her immediately, and found this terrible. They spoke for 3 hours, about the essays, about the monograph, about the journal, its subscribers, its politics, the arguments that had run through its pages for the past decade, about Elara's mother, whose pen name Clara had encountered years earlier without knowing the woman behind it, about the state of women's education and what it would look like in 10 years, and whether anyone publishing right now was going to matter in 20. Clara drank 2 cups of tea and ate 4 biscuits, and occasionally paused in the middle of a sentence to to find the right word, with the focused patience of someone for whom language was a precision instrument. At one point, she said, looking at the bookshelves along the wall, "Your shelves are extraordinary. You have read all of these?" "Most of them," Alara said. "The ones on the upper right, I am told, are my father's, which means they are largely unread." Clara laughed. "I can always tell," she said. "Unread books have a particular posture." Then she stopped and said, more carefully, "Forgive me." I spoke without thinking. Alara understood what she meant. She had said she could tell the unread books by looking at them, and then remembered, a beat too late, that looking was supposed not to be available to her guest. "I remember where things are on those shelves very well." Clara looked at her with an expression that Alara could not fully see, but could feel the weight of. Then she nodded, once, and said, "Of course," and moved back to the question she had been asking before, and did not revisit the moment. This was, Alara thought, the mark of genuine intelligence and genuine kindness. The ability to leave something alone, without drama when leaving it alone, was the right thing to do. She did not know, when Clara left late in the afternoon and the door closed behind her, whether Clara had understood more than she had shown. She sat in the empty sitting room and went over the 3 hours in detail, the way she went over everything now, methodically, looking for the loose threads, the small errors, the moments where she had been less than perfectly consistent. She found two. A moment when Clara had moved the vase on the side table to set down her second cup of tea, and Alara had moved slightly, automatically, to accommodate the new position of the object before being told it had moved. And a moment near the end, when a bird had struck the window glass outside with a sudden sharp crack, and she had turned toward the sound, correctly, appropriately, as anyone would, but had turned too fast, and too directly, with the visual tracking of a person who could see the window, and was reacting to what she expected to see there. 2 moments. She sat with them. Clara had either noticed both and said nothing, or had noticed neither, or had noticed one. Alara found that she could not determine which, and that this was the thing that kept her still in the chair, long after the fire had gone low, and the room had gone dark, and she had forgotten, for once, to pretend that the darkness was the same as it always was for her. She was maintaining a lie with someone she had come to respect. That was what the afternoon had clarified, sitting there in the specific form of Clara Finch being exactly as she had seemed in the letters, genuine, rigorous, generous. And there was no clean way to account for that, no angle from which it looked acceptable. It was what it was. She could stop, she could write a letter, she could confess the whole thing, not just to Clara but to all of it, her father, the household, everyone. She could end it. She sat with that possibility for a long time, the same way she had sat with the original idea of the deception 14 months ago, and turned it around to look at every side. And she arrived at the same answer she always arrived at, which was not that the deception was good or right, but that stopping it, right now, in this way, without a plan, would undo everything she had built and return her to exactly the situation she had escaped from, without anything changed except the strength of her father's resolve to finish what he had started. She was not ready to stop. She went back to her room. She picked up the monograph manuscript, which was now 30 pages long. She read what she had written. It was the best work she had ever done. She picked up a pen and kept going. The summer that followed Clara's visit was the quietest of the 3 years so far, and also, in ways that surprised her, the most productive. She had finished the monograph and sent it, and was waiting for its response. And in the waiting, she did something she had not done since the beginning of the deception. She stopped directing everything. She had been directing everything, every gesture, every facial position, every response to sound and touch and the movement of people through rooms, for 18 months, with the absolute concentration of someone who understood that the alternative to absolute concentration was exposure. She had not relaxed. She had not, in any real sense, rested. She began, that summer, to let the performance settle in a different way, not to lower her guard, that was not possible and she did not try, but to stop fighting the performance and simply allow it to be what it had become, which was part of how she moved through the world, an integrated layer rather than an effort of will. The effort of will had been necessary in the beginning. It was not necessary anymore. The performance had become something she wore rather than something she held. The release of energy this produced was considerable. She had not known how much of her daily capacity had been going to the active maintenance of it until the active maintenance was no longer required, and she found herself with hours she had not expected, hours whose contents she had to decide. She decided on the garden, not as a performance, not as an opportunity to demonstrate the navigation skills of the blind. She had done plenty of that, and it had served its purpose. The garden as itself, as a place she had loved before any of this began, and had neglected during it, because the garden required a kind of unhurried attention that the performance had not been able to spare. Her mother had planted most of it. The kitchen garden had come from practical necessity, but the section behind the south wall, the long bed with the roses and the perennial border, and the 2 apple trees that had been there longer than anyone in the household could account for, that had been her mother's project, begun when Alara was 10, tended with the focused love that her mother gave to things she believed in. She spent 2 hours most afternoons in the garden that summer. She worked with her hands in the soil and felt the particular satisfaction of a task that produces its results directly and visibly and does not require any management of anyone's perception. She was in the garden, in late July, when Owen Brierly came down the lane path unannounced and found her there, with dirt on her hands and her attention on the state of the rose bed, and for 1 full second she simply looked at him. Directly, openly, the way she would have looked at someone approaching the garden before any of this began, before she remembered and shifted. He had not appeared to notice, or he had appeared not to appear to notice, which she understood by now might mean different things. He helped her for an hour with the rose bed. He had large, competent hands and a natural patience with physical work, and they spoke while they worked about things that had nothing to do with blindness or railways or county society, about whether the soil in the north end of the bed was draining properly, about the best way to support the climbing rose on the south wall, about what her mother had planted, and what had survived and what had not. It was the most natural hour she had spent in the garden in 3 years, and it was made so by the specific quality of ordinary company that Owen Brierly had always provided, without appearing to know he was providing it. After he left, she stood at the south wall with her hand on the climbing rose and thought about what it meant to be honest, not about the deception, not about the specific mechanics of it, but about the broader question of what it meant to be honest in a life. Her mother had been honest in her work and had kept it hidden. She herself was honest in her work and had kept the work and the person behind it carefully separated from everything else. Was that the same thing? Was the honesty of the work sufficient, if the life around the work was built on something other than honesty? She did not arrive at a satisfying answer that afternoon. She suspected she was not going to arrive at one that summer. These were questions whose answers came slowly, if they came at all, and she had learned not to push at them the way she pushed at intellectual problems, where pressure produced resolution. Some questions resolved differently, not by being answered, but by being lived past, until you had enough information to stop needing the answer in the same way. She went inside and washed her hands and wrote a letter to Clara Finch that had nothing in it about the deception or the monograph. It was about the garden and what she had planted and the quality of the soil in the south bed. It was the most ordinary letter she had written in years. Clara wrote back and said that the ordinary letters were her favorite ones. Alara read this and understood, without any complication, that Clara had meant it exactly as written. That was the thing about the summer of the second year. It was not a summer of decisions or turning points or the clarification of anything major. It was a summer of her life, an actual summer, with dirt on her hands and correspondence that was about gardens and books and the weather, and the work that had been sent out and was waiting for its response, and the small daily things of a household that continued its rhythms around her, regardless of what she was or was not pretending. She would remember it, later, as the summer she stopped waiting for the thing to end and started living inside it differently. As the summer she began to understand that the room she had fought for was not only a room for the work, it was a room for her. The second winter was harder than the first. Not because the performance had slipped. It had not. If anything, it had deepened, become more economical, more precise, stripped of the few small redundancies that had existed in the early months. She no longer had to think about where to direct her eyes when she entered a room. She no longer had to calculate the gap between hearing a sound and reacting to it. These things had settled into something close to reflex, which was exactly what she had needed them to become, and also, on certain nights, the thing that made it hardest to sleep. The hardness of the second winter came from a different direction. It came from loneliness. She had not expected this, and she spent some time being irritated at herself for not having expected it. She had been alone before, had always been, in a certain sense, more comfortable in her own company than in the company of most people. She had a rich interior life, as her mother used to say, meaning she had a mind that generated enough traffic that she rarely needed external stimulation to stay occupied. She had her books. She had her writing. She had the correspondence with Clara Finch, which had deepened since the visit, and now arrived twice monthly, and ran to 5 or 6 pages on each side. But there is a difference between solitude chosen and solitude imposed, and there is a further difference between ordinary solitude and the specific solitude of someone who cannot, under any circumstances, lower their guard in company. Every person who came into a room she was in required her to be vigilant. Every conversation required a portion of her attention to be directed at the performance rather than at the person she was talking to. Every moment of being with another person was, on some level, an exercise in not being fully present with that person. And she had been doing this for 18 months. She had not had a single unguarded conversation with anyone outside of her room since the deception began. Not even with Mary, not even with Dr. Moore, not even with Francis, who had come once more and had been as carefully honest as before, without ever asking the direct question. Every exchange was mediated by what she was pretending to be. Even her letters to Clara were written by E. Moreland, which was close to Alara but was not quite her, was the version of her that had a pen name and a literary career, and no immediate personal crisis requiring management. She was alone in a particular way. She was alone the way a person who speaks a language no one else around them knows is alone. Present, functional, engaged even, but untranslatable, and therefore, in the deepest sense, not quite reached. She took long walks in the mornings. This was something she had always done, but now it served double purpose. Both her genuine need for air and movement, and the practical advantage of a setting in which the performance was simpler. Outdoors, navigating by sensation and sound was entirely plausible. She could let her eyes move more naturally when her face was turned toward hedgerows and fields rather than toward people. She could let her shoulders drop for a few minutes. She could, briefly and imperfectly, approximate being just a person in a landscape. On one of these mornings in February, she encountered Mr. Owen Brierly. Owen Brierly was the son of a family 2 miles east, a solid family, not wealthy but stable, with a grain business that had done respectably for 3 generations. He was 26, not yet married, and had the particular kind of ease about him that comes from having grown up largely outdoors doing physical work, a physical confidence, a comfort in his body, a way of standing in a field that suggested the field was where he thought he was supposed to be. She had known him peripherally for most of her life, the way people know the children of nearby families, by sight and by report, and by the occasional overlap at public events, without ever having a conversation of any real duration. He had come upon her on the lane near the south field, and he had greeted her with the particular careful cheerfulness of someone who had been told about her condition and was trying very hard to get the manner right. "Miss Voss," he said, from about 5 feet away, so that she would hear his position before he came closer. "Good morning to you." She turned toward his voice at the appropriate pace. "Good morning," she said. "Owen Brierly," he said, "from along the Fieldstone Road. We've met at the Aldermere dinners a few times, years back." "I remember," she said. He fell into step beside her, matching her pace, and they walked. He talked about the weather. He talked about the state of the lane after the recent rain. He talked about a problem he was having with a section of his family's north field. He talked the way certain people talk when they are nervous, and filling silence, and gradually relaxing into the conversation as it goes on, and the silences become less alarming. She listened and responded and found him, to her genuine surprise, pleasant company. He was not trying to impress her. He was not being careful with her in the way that made her feel fragile. He was just talking, the way a person talks to someone walking alongside them in a field. They walked for perhaps half an hour before they reached the point where the lane turned toward her estate, and he needed to continue in another direction. "I'll come this way again Thursday," he said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a statement of intention. It was somewhere between the two. An offering, left open. I usually come out around this time, she said. He did come Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and by the time spring arrived, they had fallen into a pattern of walking twice a week that had not been formally arranged, but that both of them seemed to be maintaining by the simple method of arriving and not arriving. These walks were the most dangerous thing she had done since the beginning, not because Owen Brierley was particularly observant, he was not, or not in ways that threatened her, not because the conversations went into territory that required careful navigation. They were, by unspoken mutual agreement, conversations about immediate and tangible things, the world visible from the lane they walked on, the weather, the county news, the books she mentioned casually, and that he listened to with genuine interest, even though he did not read much himself. No, the danger was simpler and harder to manage. She liked him, and she was performing for him, every time. He thought she was blind. He walked slightly to her left and slightly ahead on narrow parts of the lane, to clear the path. He described things sometimes, a hawk overhead, a particular formation of cloud, with the easy naturalness of someone who had come to think of it as normal conversation, not as compensating for a limitation. He had stopped being careful with her in the self-conscious way. He was just careful with her in the ordinary way, the way you are careful with a person you have come to pay attention to. This was the specific kind of loneliness that the second winter had produced. Not the absence of company, but the presence of company that was built on a false foundation. She did not know what she wanted to happen with Owen Brierley. She was not in love with him. She was not certain she was capable, in her current situation, of something as open and available as being in love with anyone. But she cared about his good opinion, and she cared about not being a false thing to him, and she was. Every Thursday and every other day they met, both of those things. Dr. Moore noticed the change in her. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, without comment initially, filing it, returning to it later, when he had thought about it enough to say something useful. "You are unhappier than you were," he said on a Tuesday in March, after they had gone through the professional portion of his visit and were sitting in the quiet of her mother's sitting room. "I am not unhappy," she said. "Unhappier," he said again, carefully, not agreeing or disagreeing with her statement. Something has shifted. She thought about what to say. "The first year had a quality of emergency that kept things clear," she said. "This year is different. It is more ordinary, and the ordinary is harder, in some ways." He nodded. She could feel him thinking. "You could end it," he said. Not for the first time, but differently than he had said it before. Not as a suggestion, not as a wish, but as a statement of fact, of available possibility, the way a doctor names an option without pushing. "I know," she said. "Your essays are being read by people who matter," he said. "That is real. That happened. The monograph will be real when it is finished. None of that requires the rest of it to continue." "No," she said. "It does not require it. But I am not certain what I would return to if I stopped. The same situation my father has been patient enough to hold in reserve, the same accounting, but with 18 months of performance on my record, and nothing else changed?" He was quiet. "He has not given up," she said. "He is waiting. I can hear it in the way he talks about the estate. He is waiting for me to recover, and when I recover, he intends to begin again." Another silence. "So it is not an exit," Dr. Moore said. "It is a suspension." "Yes," she said. She said it without bitterness, because bitterness was not what she felt. She felt something more like the clear-eyed recognition of a person who has looked at the situation long enough, and directly enough, that she can see its exact shape. It was not what she would have chosen, but it was what was true, and she had decided, a long time before any of this began, that truth was the thing she was going to hold on to, no matter what the performance she was currently giving required. The monograph was now 90 pages. It was the most complete and sustained work she had produced. It was about her mother, and the women who had written before her mother, and the tradition of women making meaning in secret, under false names and borrowed covers, and the carefully maintained surface of ordinariness. She thought, sometimes, that she was not just writing about that tradition. She was living inside it. The spring arrived. The estate got its color back, the green of the south field, the white blossoms on the apple trees behind the kitchen garden, the long, late light of the evenings that made everything look warmer than it was. She walked the lane twice a week with Owen Brierly and spoke to him about things that were real and could not tell him anything true. She finished the monograph in April and sent it to Clara Finch. She received a letter back in 2 weeks that began with the words, "This is the best thing we have received in 10 years of publishing, and it may be the best thing we have ever received, and I believe it will matter long after both of us are gone." She read that letter in the morning light of her room. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept her mother's letters. The 2 sets of correspondence sat there together, the letters from the woman who had started something, and the letter that said it was still going. She did not go to her desk that morning. She sat by the window with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it, the whole of it, the cost and the strange richness of it both, for a long time. In the hallway outside, the household moved around her in its daily patterns. Her father's study door opened and closed. Mary's footsteps went past on the way to the kitchen stairs. Somewhere below, a clock struck 9. She listened to it all. She watched the morning light change on the wall. The 3rd year was about to begin. She had not planned for a 3rd year. She had not planned for a 2nd one. But she was here, in this room, with this mind, and this work, and this life she had built inside the structure of a lie. And she was not ready to dismantle it without knowing what she was building in its place. She picked up her pen. She began something new. She had been thinking about Owen Brierly for 3 weeks when he came to the lane again and stood at the edge of the south field with his cap in his hands and said, in the careful voice of someone who has prepared something and is trying to deliver it accurately, that he would like, if she would not think it inappropriate, to call on her properly. She had been expecting something like this. She had been tracking the way the Thursday walks had been changing in quality, the conversation staying longer on things that were personal rather than general, the silences becoming the kind that are comfortable rather than the kind that are waiting to be filled. She had been tracking it and thinking about it and not quite knowing what to do with it. She told him she was grateful for his kindness and that she was very glad of his friendship and that she did not think a formal call would be appropriate at this time. She said it as gently as she could manage. She said it with honesty, which meant she did not claim illness or circumstance, or her father's objections. She said she did not think it was appropriate. She let the weight fall on what it was, which was a decision she was making. He received it with a dignity that she found, afterward, deeply moving. He said he understood. He said he hoped the walks could continue, if she was willing. She said she was glad of that. They walked the following Thursday as though the conversation had not happened, and then the Thursday after that, and by the 3rd week it had settled back into its ordinary shape, the ordinary good thing it had been, without any residue of difficulty. But she thought about it for weeks. She thought about what it meant that she had said no to someone who was genuine and kind and present, on grounds that she could not fully explain to him without explaining everything else. She thought about the specific shape of the loss, not of Owen Brierly specifically, not of what might have been with him, but of the category of thing, the kind of honest, unmanaged closeness that was not available to her inside the deception, that required precisely the kind of openness she had spent 3 years being unable to afford. She wrote about this. In the oblique way, she wrote about the things that were too personal to write about directly. In the 2nd essay for the Quarterly Journal, she wrote about what certain kinds of privacy cost, about the difference between privacy that is chosen and privacy that is enforced, about what it means when the things you protect yourself with are the same things that prevent you from being fully known. Clara wrote back that this was the best thing she had produced since the first essay. She wrote that it was the piece where the argument became personal, and the personal became the argument, and the two things were no longer distinguishable from each other, which was the mark of a writer who was writing about what they actually know. Alara read this letter in her room, at 11 o'clock at night, with the lamp burning on the desk, and the house quiet around her, and she felt something that she thought was not quite satisfaction, and not quite grief, but was located somewhere between the two, in the space where you hold the things that cost you, and the things you made from the cost together, without separating them. The monograph continued. She wrote through the autumn and into the winter, and the writing changed as she went, deepening in the way that work deepens when you stop being afraid of what you are about to say and simply say it. She had been careful in the early pages, careful in the way of a person who is writing for an audience they are not certain will receive the thing honestly. Somewhere in the middle of the work, that changed. She stopped being careful in that way, and started being something else. Precise, which was different, which meant she was choosing her words not to protect herself, but to be accurate. The distinction mattered. It was the difference between self-protection and self-expression, and she had needed to learn it. And the learning had cost her the first half of the monograph, but given her the second half. She sent the completed manuscript to Clara on a Thursday morning, in October, with a short note that said only, "I hope it is what it should be. I believe it may be." She believed it. That was not nothing. She had not always been certain enough of a piece of work to simply believe in it, without qualification or hedging. The monograph was good. She knew it was good in the way that you know things when you are done fighting with yourself about them. She sat at her empty writing desk for a long time after the manuscript was gone. The desk had been full for 6 months. Now it was clear. Just the wood, the lamp, the jar of pens, the small portrait of her mother in the corner. She looked at her mother's face and said, aloud, into the empty room, "I think you would have liked it." The empty room said nothing, but it did not need to. He arrived on a Friday in September, and by Saturday morning half the county knew about it. This was simply the nature of the county. Word traveled here not as rumor but as news, with the efficient, slightly breathless urgency of people who understood that information was one of the limited commodities available to them, and were determined not to waste it. By the time Alara heard the details, through Mary, who had heard them from the kitchen maid, who had heard them from the delivery boy, who had apparently gotten the information directly from a groom at the neighboring estate, the story had already been refined into something close to a legend. Duke Callum Ashvale, 34 years old, son of the Ashvale line, which had held its title and its land for 7 generations, though the land itself was in the south, and the family had not been prominent in this particular county in living memory. He had spent 10 years managing trade interests on behalf of a consortium of investors, primarily in the Eastern Territories, and had returned to England 6 months ago with a reputation that various people described variously. Cold, some said, meaning he did not perform warmth he did not feel. Difficult, others said, meaning he asked the kind of questions that people would rather not be asked. Brilliant, a smaller group said, meaning he was the kind of person who solved problems that other people had given up on, and did it in ways that others had not thought of, and did not particularly explain his methods afterward. He had come to the county because of the railway. The Aldermere Branch Railway had been failing for 2 years. It ran through 7 properties, of which the Voss estate was one, and the question of whether it would continue to operate, or be sold to a larger company that would likely close the branch and redirect the routing, had been sitting unresolved in the way that county financial questions sat unresolved when several parties had competing interests, and no single one of them had the resources or the appetite to force a conclusion. Duke Ashvale was reportedly representing a group of investors who saw value in the branch if managed properly. He was here to assess the situation. He was staying at the Pemberton House, which was the largest private residence in the immediate area, and whose owner, a man named Gerald Pemberton, had known Ashvale's father. All of this Alara absorbed with attention, seated in the breakfast room 2 days after his arrival, while her father explained the situation to the estate solicitor, whose name was Hartley, and whose visits always meant something was happening that her father was not certain he could manage alone. She had been aware of the railway situation for a year. She had been tracking it through the household accounts, which showed the quarterly payments that the railway agreement provided, and which had been the difference, in several difficult quarters, between the estate maintaining its basic functioning and beginning to fail more visibly. She understood what a renegotiation of the railway agreement might mean. Either an improvement in the arrangement if the new investors were serious and well-funded, or a dissolution of it if they decided the branch was not worth maintaining. She understood, before her father had entirely finished his explanation to the solicitor, that this was going to be a situation she needed to monitor carefully. What she did not understand, could not have predicted from the information available, was what Duke Ashvale himself would be like. She met him for the first time, at a dinner held at the Pemberton House, 10 days after his arrival. She had not wanted to go. The dinners at the Pemberton House were large, public, and required sustained performance in close proximity to people she did not know well. They were among the most demanding engagements she managed, but her father had been clear that her absence would be noted, and that this was not a moment to invite speculation about the state of the Voss household's willingness to engage with new developments. She came with her father, on his arm, and was positioned at the dinner table, between the solicitor's wife, Mrs. Hartley, who was a kind woman, who had managed Ilara's condition in previous dinners with admirable naturalness, and a clergyman from the next village, whose name she did not immediately catch. She could hear the room around her, the distinct conversations, the sound of the silver, the particular acoustic of the Pemberton dining room, with its high ceiling, and its tendency to return every sound slightly larger than it had gone up. She heard Duke Ashvale's voice, before she had any occasion to turn toward him. He was seated across the table and 3 positions to her left, and he was talking to Gerald Pemberton about the eastern trade routes, and his voice was, she thought, the voice of a man who had learned to speak precisely because imprecision in his profession had consequences. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It had a quality of economy that she recognized because it was a quality she herself worked at, the sense of choosing words rather than simply producing them. She filed this without turning toward him. The dinner went on. There were 12 people at the table, and the conversation moved through the usual subjects: the county news, the railway, some national political development that the clergyman was keen to discuss, and that no one else was equally keen to hear his opinion on. The food was good, and the wine was better, and after the first hour the room had settled into the warm, slightly unfocused comfort of a dinner that was going well. It was during a pause in the conversation near the end of the main course that she became aware of being looked at. This was not unusual. She had been looked at regularly in the 3 years of the deception, and had become accustomed to the particular quality of other people's looking, the brief, sympathetic assessment of someone taking stock of a situation they had been told about and wanted to confirm for themselves, or the longer, more unsettled look of someone who did not quite know how to be in the presence of a person whose condition made them uncertain of the usual rules. This was not either of those. She could not have explained how she knew. It was partly the direction from which she could feel the attention, across the table and to her left, where she had registered his position. It was partly the duration. It was partly, most specifically, a quality in the attention itself that she had no name for, except to say that it did not feel like the kind of looking that is done at something. It felt like the kind of looking that is done about something. Thinking looking, the kind that is working toward a conclusion rather than simply observing. She kept her face toward Mrs. Hartley and the middle distance between them, and continued the conversation she was in. She breathed normally. She did not react. Later in the evening, when the party had moved from the dining room to the drawing room, and the configurations had shifted in the way they always did at these events, she found herself in a small grouping near the fireplace that included Gerald Pemberton, the solicitor, and after a few minutes, the Duke himself. Gerald Pemberton made the introduction. Duke Ashvale expressed, with perfect correctness, that he was glad to meet her. He did not express anything about her condition. He did not calibrate his voice downward, or slow his words, or add the slight widening of tone that people added when they thought they were being kind. He spoke to her precisely as he spoke to the others in the group, at the same pitch, the same pace, the same assumption of complete ordinary presence. She found this startling. She also found, immediately afterward, that she needed to be very careful not to react to the startling. They spoke for perhaps 12 minutes. About the railway, primarily. He had a precise and thorough understanding of the line's operation and its potential, and he spoke about it, without the promotional gloss that investors usually applied in social settings, with a frankness that she suspected was either an affectation or a genuine personality trait, and that she was inclined, after those 12 minutes, to think was the latter. She contributed to the conversation, more than she usually did in these settings, where she kept her engagement calibrated to the level that was appropriate for a woman in her condition, at a dinner in a county she had lived in all her life. She said 3 things that were specific and pointed, and not merely polite, and he responded to each of them with a particular quality of attention, not surprised exactly, but noted, the way someone notes an unexpected piece of information and files it. He said, before the group shifted again and the conversation moved on, "I hope to see you at the Pemberton gathering next week, Miss Voss." She directed her face toward his voice. "I expect I will be there," she said. She did not return to his face, did not let her eyes settle, in the way eyes settle on a person you have been looking at, because of course she could not, and the habit was by now entirely her own. But she filed the exchange the same way she had filed his voice earlier in the evening. Carefully, precisely, with a mental notation that this was something to think about further. The Pemberton gathering the following week was smaller, an afternoon affair, garden-based, the kind of loose social occasion that the better weather of late September permitted before the autumn closed in. Alara came with her father, who spent most of the afternoon discussing the railway agreement with Hartley and two other landowners whose properties were also part of the line. She spent the afternoon moving through the garden with Mary as her guide, engaging in the kind of pleasant, brief conversations that these occasions produced. She was not specifically looking for the Duke. She was, however, not looking for him, which she acknowledged to herself with a kind of wry internal clarity. He found her at the Rose Garden, which was at the far end of the Pemberton grounds, and which was, by the time she reached it, relatively unpopulated. He was standing near the wall, with what appeared to be a glass of water, and he greeted her with the same precision and absence of performance that had characterized their first meeting. They talked about roses initially, because that was the subject the setting offered. She told him which varieties grew on the Voss estate, which her mother had planted, which she preferred. He listened. He asked a question, a specific question, about whether the older varieties took differently to the soil in this part of the county than the newer ones. That was a real question, rather than a conversational placeholder. She answered it with equal specificity, because she knew the answer. After a while he said, "You are very well informed about the estate." "I have had a great deal of time to become so," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with that same thinking-looking quality she had noticed at the dinner. Then he said something she had not anticipated. "What were you doing with your time," he said, "before you had so much of it?" It was a question that assumed, quietly, that she had been doing something. Not a question about her condition, or her management of it. A question about her, the person, and what she had put herself to. She looked at the roses. "Reading," she said. "Writing. Corresponding." "On what subjects?" "Philosophy, primarily," she said. "And the tradition of women's intellectual work. What it has looked like, and how it has been done, and what has been built from it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "E. Moreland." Everything in her went absolutely still. "I beg your pardon," she said, very carefully. "The essays in the Quarterly Journal," he said, and his voice was even, unreadable. "I have read them, all of them. And the monograph, which a colleague sent me 2 months ago. The voice is very particular, very specific. It reminded me, when I was sitting at dinner last week, of the way you spoke about the railway, the same quality of thought, the same way of arriving at a point by a route that is not the expected one." He paused. "I may be entirely wrong." She kept her face directed at the roses. "You are not wrong," she said, and then she stopped, because she had not planned to say that, and she did not know what came next. The admission sat in the air between them for a long moment. He did not respond immediately, and she found that the silence was not uncomfortable in the way she had expected. She had expected, in the fraction of time between saying it and waiting for his response, that the silence would carry the particular tension of a situation about to become uncontrollable. Instead, it had a quality she could not immediately name, a steadiness, as though the space between them had decided to hold what she had said without drama. "I recognized the logic before the style," he said when he spoke. "There is an argument about infrastructure in the third essay that I recognized when you made the same argument about the railway drainage this morning. The angle of approach, the way you arrive at a point by examining the assumption that everyone else accepted without examination." She looked at the roses. The late afternoon light was coming through the gap in the garden wall in a long stripe. She had not been in this section of the Pemberton garden before, and she was aware, with a sharpness that the circumstances had produced, of how precisely she could see it. The colors of the roses, the stone of the wall, the quality of the light. She had spent 3 years training her eyes to not notice. They noticed. "You should know," she said, "that you are the only person outside the household who knows any of this." "I understand that," he said. "I am telling you because it is accurate information," she said. "Not as a plea. I am not asking you for anything." "I know," he said. She considered what she wanted to say next, and was surprised to find that she wanted to say quite a lot, which was unusual. She was not typically a person who wanted to say quite a lot in unfamiliar situations. She was typically a person who rationed her words carefully and watched for the right moment. But there was something in the quality of his attention, that steady, thinking quality, that made saying things feel less like a risk and more like a reasonable action. The essays helped me understand what the deception was protecting, she said. When I began, I only knew what it was protecting me from. Lord Harwick, my father's arrangements. The specific life that was going to be organized around me, without my participation. She paused. The writing helped me understand what I was making room for. What the room was for, beyond the absence of the thing I was escaping. He was quiet for a moment. And what was the room for? This, she said. The thinking, the work, the specific experience of developing a position thoroughly and honestly, and putting it somewhere that might matter to someone else. She looked at her hands, then at the roses. My mother did it in hiding for 20 years. I did not want to spend 20 years in hiding. But I needed enough room to do the work properly, before anyone decided, based on other things about me, whether it was worth reading. He said, "The work does not need that protection anymore. The work is already out." "I know," she said. "I am aware of the irony." "That is not what I meant," he said. "I meant that the question of whether it is worth reading has already been answered. By the people reading it. By Clara Finch's response. By the fact that someone in this county managed to connect it to the person sitting in this garden, which required reading the work closely enough to recognize a way of thinking, rather than just recognizing a name." She looked at him then, really looked, with the direct attention that the performance had been training her not to give anyone for 3 years. He was looking at the roses, not at her, which made the looking possible. She studied his face, with the particular focused attention of someone who has been wanting to do this for a while, and is finally finding the moment. He was serious, in the way she had thought he was serious. Not grim, not closed, but oriented toward the actual rather than the performed. He was present in a way that few people were present, the way her mother had been present, and the way Clara Finch was present in her letters. She looked away. She looked at the rose wall. The afternoon was going gold at the edges. "I should go back to the gathering," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood. He stood a moment later, and she heard, rather than saw, him move. She turned toward the sound and managed it, the careful, fractional delay that had been so precisely practiced for so long. "Miss Voss," he said, and there was something in how he said it that made her still. She waited. "I will not tell anyone," he said. "You have my word, plainly and without conditions." She stood for a moment, then she said, "I believe you." She walked back across the Pemberton garden toward the sounds of the gathering. She did not know what she had just done or what it would lead to. She knew she had told the truth to someone who had not required her to. It was the strangest relief she had felt in 3 years. He did not react the way she had expected. She had been prepared, in the fraction of a second available to her, for either disbelief or the kind of careful repositioning that people do when they realize they have said something they want to take back. She had not been prepared for what he actually did, which was nothing. He simply stood in the rose garden in the late September afternoon and let the admission settle into the air between them, without reaching for it or stepping back from it. "The second essay," he said, after a moment, "the one about Harriet Martineau. It changed how I thought about something." She turned this over. "What did it change?" "The way I think about endurance," he said. "You wrote about how she continued working through years in which no one was reading her with the seriousness she deserved. That what kept her going was not the anticipation of recognition, but the completeness of the work itself. That a piece of thinking, once fully done, is its own justification, regardless of whether anyone is yet in a position to appreciate it." He paused. "I had been thinking about that kind of work as a wager. After reading you, I thought about it differently, as a construction that stands on its own." She was quiet. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere across the wall, the sounds of the afternoon gathering continued, voices and the occasional clink of glass, but here, it was still. "That is exactly what I meant," she said. "I thought so," he said. Another silence. This one was different from the one before. The one before had been the silence of someone having said a surprising thing and waiting to see what happened. This one was the silence of two people who have established something and are, briefly, simply in the presence of it. "You have not asked me anything," she said. "No," he said. "You identified the work. You know the pen name is mine. You are not asking me anything about the other matter. Not yet, he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not a threat, nothing like a threat, but a statement of accurate timing. He was noting that he had not asked yet, not that he would not ask at all. She felt the specific weight of a situation in which she did not know what another person intended. She had been managing this weight for 3 years, but always in situations where the stakes were familiar and the tools available to her were known. This was different. This was a person who had already shown he was operating on more information than she had calculated for. I should return to the gathering, she said. Yes, he said, and that was all. She turned from the rose garden and walked back across the grounds toward the sound of the gathering, with Mary appearing at her side, at the edge of the garden as arranged. She did not look back toward the wall where the Duke had been standing. She walked with the full composure of the performance, and did not allow a single muscle in her back to suggest that she was thinking about anything at all. But she was thinking about everything. He knew she had written the essays. He had said so plainly and without preamble. He had not said anything else. He had not drawn any connection, out loud, between a woman who wrote those essays and a woman who was supposed not to be able to read them. He had not said anything that could be reported or confronted or held up as evidence of anything, except that he had admired her mother's tradition and identified her work correctly. And he had said not yet. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was frightened exactly, though there was something in the vicinity of fear in what she felt. She did not sleep well because she was thinking with a precision and urgency that did not permit the mind to go quiet, and the thing she kept arriving at, from every direction, was this. He was not like anyone else she had encountered in 3 years of managing the situation. Everyone else had been manageable. Everyone else had been predictable, in the broad sense. Their motivations were recognizable. Their interests were clear. And the performance she gave was effective, because it was designed for people who saw what they expected to see, and did not look much further. He did not see what he expected to see. He looked further, and what was worse, what was most demanding, was that he seemed to do it without any urgency, without the quality of a person pressing an advantage. He seemed to do it the way he apparently did everything, with a kind of patient, deliberate intelligence that was not in a hurry because it trusted itself to arrive. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to her writing desk. She did not write. She sat there in the dark, not performing for anyone, just sitting in her own room, with her own eyes looking at the darkness, and she thought about what she was dealing with and what she intended to do about it. She could avoid him. The county was not large, but it was large enough that 2 people could limit their proximity if they chose to. She could instruct her father that the railway negotiations were not something she needed to be present for, and she could absent herself from the events at which he was likely to be present. She could wait him out. He had not said how long he intended to stay. She could also simply hold the line. He had not said anything that required a response beyond what she had already given. He knew she had written the essays. That was a strange coincidence. Discovered at a garden party. The kind of thing that gets noted and filed and perhaps returned to in conversation, and perhaps not. He had not said anything else. The fact that she expected him to say something else was not evidence that he would. She worked through both of these options and found them insufficient for the same reason. They required her to be reactive, to wait and see and respond. And 3 years of the deception had taught her, as clearly as anything had ever taught her anything, that the person who is reactive is always at a disadvantage. She had maintained what she had maintained, by staying 1 step ahead of the shape of things, by understanding the situation well enough to act before she was acted upon. She needed to understand this situation. She needed to understand him. The next occasion that presented itself was a smaller gathering at the Hartley home, a weekly card evening that her father attended and that she occasionally accompanied him to. The Duke was there. He was seated across the room, engaged in a conversation that appeared to be about property law, and he did not look up when she came in. Or if he did, she could not show herself noticing. She spent the first half of the evening in conversation with the solicitor's wife and with Francis, who had come from her own household for the occasion, and who sat beside Alara, with the particular careful normalcy that characterized all their interactions now. Francis asked about the monograph. Alara told her it had been received well. Francis said, with the specific quality of warmth she reserved for things she was genuinely glad about, that she was not surprised. During a pause in the card games, when the room had rearranged itself for refreshments, the Duke moved through the room with the easy navigation of a man who was comfortable in spaces where he did not know everyone, and arrived at the corner where she was sitting. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He sat down in the chair that had just been vacated beside her, and the conversation began. It was, for the first 10 minutes, entirely unremarkable. He asked about the estate's position in the railway agreement. She gave him an accurate account, because she knew it better than anyone else in her household, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. He listened. He asked follow-up questions that were specific. He absorbed her answers with a thoroughness that confirmed what she had already suspected. He had done his research, and the questions he was asking were not information gathering, but verification. He already knew most of what she was telling him. He was checking whether she did. She did. She noticed, in the middle of answering a question about the drainage arrangements along the eastern section of the railway property, that she had stopped calculating the performance in the forefront of her mind, and had allowed it to settle into the background, the way it did on her best days, when it was fully integrated rather than effortful. She was simply talking, thinking out loud about something she knew well, in the company of someone who was listening with genuine attention. It was the most natural she had felt in a conversation in 3 years. This was dangerous in the specific way that comfort is always dangerous when you cannot afford it. She pulled back slightly, not so much that it was visible, but enough to remind herself where she was and what the situation required. She answered his next question with the same accuracy, but with the careful restraint she had learned to maintain as a matter of survival. He noticed. She was almost certain of it. The conversation continued, and he said nothing, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. A slight adjustment, the way a person adjusts when a room changes temperature. She held her position. Near the end of the evening, when her father was making noises about the hour and the journey home, the Duke said, as though it had just occurred to him, "I intend to walk the railway property next Tuesday morning. I would find it useful to speak with someone from the Voss estate about the eastern section. The account I have received from the solicitor is incomplete in several respects." He looked toward her father. "Would you be available, Voss?" Her father said that he was, unfortunately, committed to business in the county seat on Tuesday. "Perhaps Miss Voss," the Duke said, and there was nothing particular in his voice, nothing that could be pointed to, nothing that was performing anything. It was just a suggestion, plainly offered. "If she is familiar with the property," her father said, with the careful pride of a man who was choosing to regard this as recognition of his family rather than examination of his household, that Alara knew the eastern section very well. "Excellent," the Duke said. She kept her face directed at the middle distance. She kept her hands perfectly still in her lap. Tuesday was 4 days away. She spent 2 of those 4 days going over everything she knew about the Duke of Ashvale. She had Mary ask careful questions through the chain of county gossip that was always in operation, and she assembled from the results a picture of a man who had spent 10 years operating in environments where everything was more complicated than it appeared, and the ability to remain stable and clear-eyed under that complexity was a professional necessity. A man who had successfully resolved 2 previous investment situations that other parties had written off as unresolvable. A man who was known, among the small number of people who knew him well, for a quality that different people described differently, but that amounted to the same thing. He paid attention to things that other people had stopped paying attention to details that other people had dismissed as minor, to the gap between what was said and what was meant. She spent those 4 days sitting with the knowledge that she was going to be alone with him, in an outdoor setting, without the social architecture of a gathering around her, and she was going to be managing the performance, while discussing something she knew well, and he was going to be paying the kind of attention he was apparently known for paying. She was not frightened. She was something adjacent to frightened, a state of high alert that was not unpleasant, that had in fact a quality of aliveness she had not felt in some time. It was the state she had been in at the very beginning, when the plan was new and the risk was total, and she had still done it because the alternative was worse. She had been very good at this from the beginning. She had built and maintained and refined an extraordinary performance under sustained pressure for 3 years. She was not going to come apart in a Tuesday morning walk on the railway property. But she was also, she acknowledged, going to be tested in a way that nothing in 3 years had tested her. by a person who already knew more about her than anyone outside the household did, and who was looking at the picture with the particular patient attention of someone who had almost worked something out and was waiting, without hurry, for the final piece to fall into place. Tuesday arrived cool and clear, with a light that made the fields look very exact, each shape precise, and the whole landscape sharply itself. She put on her coat and her walking boots. She took her cane. She went out into the morning. The night before Tuesday, she did something she had not done in 3 years. She sat at her writing desk and wrote about herself. Not in the essay form, not in the analytical structure she had developed over the previous years of working, just plainly. A first-person account of where she was, and what she had done, and what it had cost, and what she thought was happening. She wrote it the way you write things that are not meant to be published, without the management of an implied reader, without the shape of an argument. Just the facts as she held them, in the order they arrived, with all the uncertainty included. It took 2 hours. At the end of it she had 7 pages that she read once, and then folded, and put at the back of the drawer, where she kept the least accessible correspondence. Not hidden exactly, but not available to anyone who was simply looking, rather than looking specifically. She read it once because that was enough. She did not need to read it again. She had needed to write it, had needed to see the whole shape of it laid out plainly, without any of the careful management that the performance had required, and having seen it, she had what she needed. What she had was this. She was afraid. Not in the way she had been afraid in the beginning, when the fear was about being caught and the consequences of exposure. That fear had been practical, and had been managed by practical means. This was different. This was the fear of a person who had been very alone for a long time, and had found, in the space of 3 weeks, that the loneliness was no longer absolute, and who was now afraid of what it would mean if the thing that had interrupted the loneliness turned out to be something other than what it appeared. She held this clearly. She did not perform anything with it, even to herself. She just held it. Then she put the pages in the drawer, closed it, and went to bed. In the morning, she put on her coat and her walking boots, and she picked up the cane, and she went out to meet him. She was ready. Not because she had resolved anything or arrived at any particular conclusion. She was ready because she had looked at the actual situation clearly enough to know what she was walking into, and she had decided that walking into it was what she intended to do. There was a version of her life in which she had continued to avoid him, in which she had managed the Tuesday morning as carefully as she had managed every other social encounter of the past 3 years, had given him the complete performance, had navigated the railway property with absolute precision, and returned to the estate with nothing changed. She had considered that version carefully, and rejected it. Not because she was certain what the alternative would produce, but because avoiding something out of fear was not, in her understanding of herself, something she was willing to do. She had spent 3 years doing difficult things that cost her significantly, because the alternative was worse. Avoiding the Duke of Ashvale, because she was afraid of what might happen between a woman who had been honest about something real and a man who appeared to take honesty seriously, was not a cost she was willing to accept. She was, as her mother had once written in the margin of one of her own drafts, not made for avoidance. She went out into the morning. The air was clean and cold in the way of late autumn mornings that are deciding whether to be beautiful or merely difficult, and it decided, that morning, to be beautiful. She crossed the south field and came to the post and waited. He came precisely on time, and she looked at him walking across the field with the morning light behind him, and felt the particular alertness of someone who knows they are at the beginning of something, and cannot know yet what the beginning will become. She was ready for that too, ready to not know, ready to proceed without knowing, which was, she had learned over 3 years of not knowing quite a number of things, the only way anything real ever got started. The Eastern Railway property began at a wooden post at the far edge of the Voss South Field and ran for nearly a mile, in a gentle curve, before meeting the boundary with the Hartley land. The embankment was not steep, but it was distinct, a raised line of gravel and old timber that had been cut through the landscape 30 years ago, when the original surveyor had decided this was the most practical route, and had apparently not considered, or had considered, and set aside, how thoroughly it divided the fields it ran through. Ilara knew every foot of it. She had walked it, in the early months of the deception, as one of her regular morning routes, partly because the terrain was familiar enough that the performance was simpler there than anywhere more complex, and partly because she had come to find a particular quality of peace in the straightness of it, the way a railway line imposes a kind of order on a landscape, a decided path, a route that has already been chosen, and asks only that you follow it. The Duke arrived at the Southfield post at the same time she did, which was either coincidence or evidence of punctuality taken to a precise degree. He was wearing a plain coat and practical boots, and carried a small notebook, rather than the kind of case that suggested formal business. He greeted her, with the same economy he always brought to greetings. They began to walk. The conversation began with the technical, and stayed there for some time. The drainage problems at the third section, the condition of the embankment on the southern curve, the dispute over the shared land at the Hartley boundary that the solicitor had been unable to resolve. She knew all of this, and spoke about it accurately, and he took notes with the brisk efficiency of a man conducting a real assessment. There was nothing in the first half hour that was anything other than what it appeared to be. She managed the performance without difficulty. The open ground was simple terrain, no furniture to navigate, no unexpected objects, no rooms whose dimensions she needed to maintain in mental map. She walked the familiar path, and talked about things she knew, and the morning stayed uncomplicated. It was when they stopped at the section near the old crossing gate that things changed. The gate was latched, but not locked, and he reached past her to push it open. As he did, he dropped his notebook. It fell not in front of her, or behind her, but to her right. A clean drop, directly to her right, into the gap between the path and the embankment. She did not see it fall, she heard it, the soft thud of leather on packed earth. She turned toward the sound. He was watching her when she turned, not dramatically, not with the posture of someone who has set a trap and is waiting to see if the animal enters, just watching, with that same patient attention, and in his eyes was the careful stillness of someone who has just seen exactly what they came to see. She turned her face away and continued through the gate. He picked up the notebook. He made no comment. They continued along the embankment. The second moment was subtler, and she was less certain, afterward, whether it had been deliberate or not. They were walking the final section near the Hartley boundary, discussing the disputed drainage channel, and she was describing the original land survey that she had found in the estate records and that gave the Voss family a cleaner claim to the maintenance arrangement than the current solicitor appeared to understand. She was concentrating on the detail of what she was saying, and she let the performance settle one fraction further into the background than she usually permitted. He was to her right, taking notes. He said, without looking up from the notebook, "There was an article in the Morning Post last month about the eastern trade routes. It made an argument about infrastructure that I thought was entirely wrong, but I could not place why until I read it in the context of your monograph." She was in the middle of a sentence about the drainage survey. She finished the sentence. Then she said, "Which argument?" "The one about the relationship between investment and local need," he said. "The Post argued that infrastructure follows capital, that you build the railway where the money already is. Your monograph argues the inverse, or rather, argues that the assumption has never been properly examined, and that when you examine it, it does not hold." She walked in silence for a moment. "The assumption does not hold," she said. "What you see, when you look at actual infrastructure development over a century, is that the investments that lasted were the ones that built toward need, rather than toward existing capital. The ones that followed the money often collapsed when the money moved." He wrote something in the notebook. "Yes," he said. They reached the boundary post and stopped. The Hartley land spread out ahead of them, brown and tidy in the autumn morning. He turned to look back along the embankment the way they had come. "You know this property very well," he said. "You described the drainage arrangement at the third section from memory, with more accuracy than the survey maps I was given." "I have walked this property regularly for 3 years," she said. He turned toward her. She felt the direction of his attention without letting herself respond to it visually. "You described the color of the drainage markers at the third section," he said. "The red ones that were replaced 2 years ago, and the older green ones at the original installation points." She did not move. "You mentioned the color," he said, very quietly. "You said the newer markers were red, and the original ones, the ones installed in 1867, were green, and there are still 2 of them visible at the south side of the embankment." She stood very still. The morning was very quiet. Somewhere on the Hartley land, a crow was doing something in the far hedgerow. She could hear it. She had said the colors. She had been talking about something she knew, and she had included the colors without thinking about it, and she had not caught it, and he had caught it immediately. 3 years. She had maintained the performance without a significant error for 3 years, and she had just, in a single sentence, spoken without sufficient care, handed him the most direct piece of evidence available. She kept her face directed at the middle distance. She breathed carefully. "I was told about the markers," she said, "by the groundsman, when he replaced them. The groundsman left the estate 14 months ago," the Duke said. Not urgently, not triumphantly, as a fact, stated in the same voice he used for all facts. A long silence. The crow in the hedgerow made its sound again. The morning light came at a lower angle now, catching the top of the embankment and making the gravel shine. She turned to face him directly. She did not do it in the careful, slightly imprecise way she had trained herself to turn toward people's voices. She turned with her eyes finding his face immediately, directly, with the full visual clarity of a person who can see the face they are turning toward. She looked at him. And he looked back at her, without any particular expression. Not surprise, because he was not surprised. And not satisfaction, because it did not appear to be satisfaction he had been after. "How long have you known?" she said. "I have not known," he said. "I have suspected, with increasing certainty, for about 3 weeks. This morning has made it certain." He paused. The notebook was intentional. "I apologize for that." "Do not apologize," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "It is what I would have done." He was quiet for a moment. She was watching his face, and she could see him thinking, not performing thought, not preparing a speech, actually thinking through what to say next, and deciding as he went. "I have not told anyone," he said. "I do not intend to." She held his gaze. "Why not?" He looked at her for a moment before he answered. "Because whatever your reasons are, they are yours," he said. "I have some understanding of what it is to structure a situation carefully, because the alternative is worse. I do not think it is my place to dismantle what you have built, simply because I have seen through it." She said nothing. She was looking at him with the full attention she had not permitted herself to give anyone in 3 years, and it was strange, the sensation of looking directly and freely at a face, of reading it in the ordinary way, of seeing what was there and trusting the reading. What was there was not performance. What was there was a man who had said what he meant. "You said you had some understanding," she said, "of structuring a situation because the alternative is worse." "Yes." "Tell me." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he was going to decline. Then he said, "I spent 8 years managing an operation that required me to appear to be something other than what I was, not in the same way as this. But I understand what it costs to maintain a thing daily, and what it does to the way you move through the world, and the way you allow yourself to be in the presence of other people." He paused. "I came home 6 months ago, partly because the cost had become greater than the return." She absorbed this. The morning was very clear, and the fields were very exact, and she was standing on the railway embankment with a man she had known for 3 weeks, and she was looking at him openly, without performance, for the first time.
"What do you intend to do?"
she said. "With what I know?" "With all of it, the railway, the estate, any of it." He looked down at the notebook in his hands. "The railway is a sound investment if the management is reformed, and the land agreements are renegotiated on honest terms. I intend to recommend that to my consortium. That will require conversations with your solicitor and your father about the eastern section." He looked back up. "Those conversations will be straightforward, if the people involved are straightforward." "My father is not straightforward," she said. "He is not dishonest, but he is not straightforward." "I know," the Duke said. "I have met him several times." "And the rest of it?" she said. "I do not know yet," he said. "I know what I think about your work. I know what I think about what I have seen this morning. I am still considering what that amounts to." He said this without any agenda she could find in it. No hidden direction, no managed expectation. He was simply telling her where he was, the same way she might describe a position on a map. She found this, to her considerable surprise, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. They walked back along the embankment in the direction of the Voss estate. The conversation returned to the railway, the practical questions, the land agreements, the specific requests he would need to make of the solicitor. She answered everything accurately, and he continued to take notes, and there was nothing in the way they walked that would have appeared, to anyone observing from the fields around them, to be anything other than what it had been announced as, a formal property assessment walk. But she was walking without the performance. She was walking as herself, in the morning, in the open air, alongside someone who knew what she was, and had, without any requirement from her to justify or explain it, chosen to let it stand. She did not know what to do with this. She did not have a category for it. 3 years of managing a carefully controlled situation had not produced a framework for this. When they reached the South Field post, they stopped. He said that he would follow up with the solicitor by the end of the week. She said that she would make sure the relevant estate records were available. They parted with the same formal correctness that had characterized the beginning of the morning. She walked back across the South Field toward the estate. She kept her pace steady. She kept her cane in her hand. She kept the whole external presentation intact, because Mary was visible at the kitchen garden entrance, and the household was in its normal morning activity, and none of that had changed. But inside, something had shifted. She could feel the shift, the way you feel. A change in the weather before the rain arrives. Not fully present yet, not certain of its nature yet, but unmistakably coming. She did not know where this was going. She knew, for the first time in 3 years, that she was not the only one deciding. She sat at her writing desk that night for a long time. She was not writing. She was holding a pen and looking at a blank page and thinking, with the particular intensity that she usually reserved for work. The kind of thinking that is not planning, but is closer to listening to the full shape of a situation before deciding what to do with it. The Duke of Ashvale knew she was not blind. She wrote that sentence on the page, plainly, and looked at it. He knew. He had known for 3 weeks, from his own account. He had seen the performance and identified it as a performance, not through a single dramatic error, but through the accumulation of small things that did not add up. The colors she had named today, the way she had turned, the way she had moved through rooms at the Pemberton gatherings, with too much ease, too much spatial certainty, the way her responses came too precisely timed to be entirely managed by sound alone. He had assembled these small things, and arrived at a conclusion, and had said nothing, and had arranged the Tuesday morning walk, and had dropped his notebook, and had waited for what she did. She wrote, "He tested me." Then she wrote, "I do not blame him." She sat with that for a while. She had expected to feel, when this moment arrived, and she had known, in some deep practical part of herself, that this moment would arrive eventually, a particular kind of acute fear. The fear of the thing being over, of the situation collapsing, of the consequences arriving. She had spent 3 years in the low background hum of that anticipated fear, and had learned to function with it the way people learn to function with a sound they can hear but cannot stop. But the acute fear had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something more complicated and less predictable. She felt exposed, certainly. That was accurate. That was a fact. She felt the specific vulnerability of a person who has been seen and cannot unbe seen. But underneath that she felt something she had not anticipated at all. She felt, very quietly, relieved. 3 years. 3 years of absolute vigilance, absolute management. The daily compression of a self that was considerably larger than the space she had been performing it in. 3 years of looking without appearing to look, of listening past the performance, of reading rooms and people and conversations, through the filter of a deception that was brilliant and necessary, and had cost her more than she had been able to admit even to herself. And now one person knew. One person had seen through it, and chosen, for reasons that she was still examining, to leave it standing, had chosen not to use the knowledge against her, had chosen, instead, to name what he saw, and then wait for her response. She picked up the pen and wrote, "He gave me the truth, and did not make it a weapon." She looked at what she had written for a long time. Outside, the night was very quiet. The house was still. The lamp made its small, steady light on the desk and on the page. She thought about what it meant to trust someone. Not to trust them because they had earned it through a long history of demonstrated reliability, which was the ordinary path to trust, but to trust them because the evidence you had of their intentions was recent and specific and pointed consistently in one direction. She did not know him well. She knew what she had observed. She knew what he had done and had not done. She knew that he had contacted Clara Finch. She did not know this yet, that was coming, but she knew that the conversation she had had on the embankment was the conversation of a person who was operating from a real position, not a performed one. She had spent 3 years developing an instrument for detecting the difference. She was using it now, and what it was telling her was that the Duke of Ashvale had meant what he said. This was not the same as knowing what he intended. Meaning what you say, and knowing clearly what you intend to do with what you mean, are different things. But it was enough to work with. It was enough to continue with. She put the pen down. She did not feel resolved. She felt, rather, that the situation had clarified, and clarification was not the same as resolution, but was far better than confusion. She closed the writing desk. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about the south field post, and the morning, and the way the light had been exact and clear. She had not stopped being afraid. But she had been afraid before, had been afraid every single day for 3 years, and the fear had not stopped her then. She did not intend to let it stop her now. She had 4 days before he came to the estate for the railway meetings. She used them. Not to prepare a story. She had been doing that for 3 years, and she did not need the practice. What she used the 4 days for was something harder and less familiar. She tried to prepare herself to be honest. Not about the deception, not yet. She was not yet certain how that conversation would go, or when it would happen, or with whom. But the Tuesday morning walk had done something to the inner structure of what she had been maintaining. It had created a crack, not in the performance itself, but in her relationship to it. The performance was still intact, the household saw no change. But she herself, inside the performance, now knew that someone outside it could see her. And the experience of that, of being seen, after 3 years of careful invisibility, was doing something she had not anticipated. It was making her angry. Not at the Duke. She had examined this carefully, because she understood the risk of misplacing anger when your situation is complicated and your emotions have been compressed by years of sustained restraint. The anger was not at him. The anger was at the situation, at the specific injustice of having had to build the deception in the first place, at the 3 years of daily performance, at the loneliness she had spoken about only to herself, at the fact that a woman as capable as she knew herself to be had been reduced to this elaborate and exhausting construction simply because someone had decided she was a piece in a game she had not chosen to play. She sat with this anger for 4 days. She let it be what it was. She did not perform anything with it, and she did not bury it. She just held it and looked at it and acknowledged it as accurate information about how things actually were, which was the only honest thing to do with anger when the anger was honest. And she thought about the Duke. She thought about what he had said on the embankment, the 8 years of managing a situation that required him to appear to be something other than what he was. She thought about the particular way he had said it, not as a confidence offered to create intimacy, but as a fact offered because it was relevant, and because honesty, in his apparent view, was a courtesy that should be extended to anyone who had just been confirmed in their own significant act of honesty. She thought about the way he had said he did not know yet what the rest of it amounted to. The careful accuracy of that. Not "I will figure it out," with its implication of control and conclusion drawing. Not "I do not know," with its implication of having given up on understanding. Just, "I am still considering what it amounts to." A working position, a mind in the middle of something. She recognized this. It was the way her own mind worked, and it was rare enough in the people she encountered that it stopped her. Every time she saw it in him. The way you stop when you see something in a landscape that you have only seen in descriptions. On the morning of the railway meeting, which was a Thursday, she came downstairs earlier than usual. She sat in the drawing room and waited in the ordinary posture of the performance, while the household prepared for the formal visitors. Her father arrived from his rooms. The solicitor, Hartley, arrived at 9. The Duke arrived at 15:15, with a second man who was introduced as his professional associate, a careful person of about 40, whose name was Edmund Crane. The meeting took place in her father's study, from which she was excluded by the combined operation of her father's professional pride and the assumption, not challenged by anyone, that the business of railway investments was not a matter for a blind young woman, regardless of how much she knew about the relevant property. She sat in the drawing room and heard, at intervals, the shape of what was happening, from the sounds that carried through the study door. Her father's voice, somewhat elevated in the second half of the first hour, suggesting a point of resistance. Hartley's more measured tone. The Duke's voice, always even, always at the same pitch regardless of what was being said. Edmund Crane came out at 11 to retrieve a set of documents that had been left in his case in the hallway. He found Alara in the drawing room and apologized for the interruption. "How is it going?" she asked, meaning the meeting. He looked at her, not with the careful uncertainty that most people brought to her, but with the straightforward assessment of a professional, evaluating a situation. "The point about the eastern drainage section is proving complicated," he said. "We have the survey records that suggest the Voss estate has the primary maintenance claim, but the Hartley family's solicitor has filed a counter-interpretation. The counter-interpretation is wrong," she said. "The original installation documents from 1867 specify a shared arrangement with a 20-year review clause. The 20-year review was conducted in 1887, and the Voss estate's claim was confirmed in writing. That document exists in the estate records in the second drawer of the writing cabinet in this room." She said this calmly and without performance. She did not gesture toward the cabinet because she was not supposed to know exactly where it was in the room. But she had told him precisely enough. He looked at the writing cabinet. He looked at her. He said, "Excuse me a moment," and went back into the study. 15 minutes later, the study door opened and her father came out, holding a document that she could hear him unfolding. He went back in. She heard, through the door, a brief exchange in voices whose tone had changed. The resistance in her father's voice was gone, replaced by the particular sound of a man who has just had a useful surprise. The meeting concluded at 12:30. The Duke was the last to leave. Her father accompanied the solicitor and Edmund Crane to the front door, and there was a pause in the hallway, and then the Duke came back into the drawing room. She was still in her chair. She was in the performance. Face correctly directed, hands correctly still, posture correctly. The posture of a woman receiving a visitor she could hear, but not see. He sat down across from her. "The 1887 document resolved the meeting," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew it was there." "Yes. You also knew, precisely, what argument it resolved, and why the counter-interpretation was wrong, and that Edmund needed to know about it at that specific moment." She kept her face directed at the window beyond his head. "The eastern section is part of the estate. I have been managing the household accounts for 2 years. The relevant documents are in this room." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Voss," he said, and then he stopped. And when he continued, something in his voice was different, not softer, exactly, but less measured, more direct in the way that people are direct when they are choosing directness rather than performing it. "I would like to speak with you honestly, not about the railway." She made herself breathe normally. "Then speak," she said. He said, "I have spent the past 3 weeks trying to understand what I was looking at. I came here for a railway assessment. I was not expecting to find the author of work I had read and admired. I was not expecting to find someone who had arranged their life with extraordinary discipline in order to protect something I think is worth protecting." He paused. "I am not here to dismantle what you have built. I told you that on the embankment, and I meant it, but I would like to understand it. Not the mechanics of it, I can see those clearly enough. The why, what it is protecting, what you are working toward." She sat with this. She had not prepared for this question in any of her 4 days of preparation, which meant she had not known, until now, that she needed to. She said, "My mother spent 20 years writing under a name that was not her own, because the world she lived in had decided that her ideas were only acceptable if they appeared to come from someone the world had already decided was acceptable. She was a better thinker than most of the men who reviewed her work under her pen name, without knowing they were reviewing a woman. She was careful and rigorous and honest, and she never got to say any of that openly in her lifetime." She stopped. Then she continued, "I am not my mother. I have had advantages she did not have, and I have done things she could not have imagined doing, and I am not operating in the same world she was. Exactly. Though I am operating in enough of the same world that I knew, when my father told me about Lord Harwick, precisely what my life would become if I did not find a way out. Not cruel. Not terrible, in any dramatic sense. Just reduced. A life organized around someone else's requirements, and called a partnership by the people organizing it. She paused. The deception gave me room, she said. That is the thing it has given me, and that is the thing that has made it worth the cost. Room to do the work, room to think without being managed, room to become someone whose work can stand on its own before anyone has decided, based on other things about me, whether it is worth reading. She stopped. The room was very quiet. He said, "The monograph is already standing on its own." "Yes," she said. "And you intend to keep writing?" "Yes. Regardless of how this current situation resolves." She turned toward his voice, fully, directly, with her eyes finding his face. She did not catch herself. She just looked at him. "Yes," she said, "regardless." He looked back at her, with the steady attention that she had come to recognize as his actual face, the one underneath any social configuration, serious and clear and fully present. "Then you need," he said, "something different from what you currently have. Not the deception. What the deception gave you, the room, the protection, the ability to work. You need a situation that provides those things without requiring daily performance of something that is costing you more than you are perhaps acknowledging." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I am aware of the cost," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not suggesting you are not. I am saying that I can see it from here, in a way that perhaps you cannot, and I am telling you because I think you deserve to hear it from someone who is not invested in you not hearing it." She was quiet for a long time. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them performed anything at all. "What are you suggesting?" she said. He said, "Nothing yet. I told you on the embankment that I am still considering what this amounts to. That remains true." He paused. "But I wanted you to know that I am considering it, that someone is considering it, with the actual facts in front of them." He stood. He said that he would be in the county for another 3 weeks, and that the railway matters would require several more meetings, and that he hoped she would be well. She said she would be. He left. She sat in the drawing room alone, in the October afternoon, with the sound of the last of the railway party's carriages disappearing down the lane. She sat in the performance, out of habit, for several minutes, after there was no one left to perform for. Then she stopped. She let her shoulders drop. She looked at the room, the cabinet where the document had been, the chairs where they had been sitting, the window with the afternoon coming through it at its October angle. She thought about what he had said, every sentence of it. She went through it the way she went through everything, carefully, methodically, looking for the places where it could mean something other than what it appeared to mean. She could not find those places. As far as she could tell, he had meant exactly what he said. She had been in the presence of many people in 3 years. She had been in the presence of kindness and calculation, and genuine warmth, and social performance, and the entire range of human behavior that county society offered. She had become an exceptional reader of it, because her survival had required that she be. What she had not been in the presence of, in 3 years, was someone who simply said what they meant, and meant what they said, and left the implications to develop without managing them. She sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. Outside, October was doing what October does, going golden and precise, making the light do something extraordinary, for a brief window, before the gray came in, and the year turned toward its darker half. She watched it through the window, and did not pretend otherwise. She went to see Francis 2 days after the drawing room conversation. She had not planned to. She had planned to use the days between the railway meeting and the Duke's return for thinking. For the methodical, private thinking she did best alone, with her desk and her paper and the lamp and the house quiet around her. But on the second morning she woke early and lay in the dark for an hour, and understood, with the clarity that early morning sometimes produces, that she did not want to think alone. She wanted to talk. She wanted to be in the presence of another person, and have a real conversation about what was actually happening. Francis was the only person available who could fill that requirement. She walked the 2 miles to the Hartley house in the morning, which was gray and cool, and had the particular quality of October mornings that have decided to get business done without ceremony. She arrived unannounced, and Francis received her in the morning room with the expression of someone who has been half expecting this and is glad it has arrived. They sat across from each other at the small table. Francis poured tea. She did not ask anything immediately, which Alara recognized as the specific intelligence of someone who understood that the person who had walked 2 miles unannounced had come to say something and needed to be allowed to find the way in. Alara told her. Not everything, not the deception itself, not the 3 years of mechanics. She had not told Frances the specifics, and she did not tell them now. But she told her about the Duke, about the railway walks and the rose garden and the drawing room conversation. She told her what he had said, and what she had said, and what she was now sitting with. Frances listened through all of it without interrupting, which was something she was good at, genuinely good, not the performed listening that social occasions required, but the real kind, the kind that is actually receiving what is being said and holding it accurately. When Alara finished, Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are frightened." "Yes," Alara said. "Not of him specifically. No. Of what it means to stop being frightened of the situation and start being frightened of something else, of something I might want." Frances looked out the window. Her husband's estate spread out beyond the glass, tidy and comfortable, and organized around his requirements, in precisely the way Alara had been afraid of, and had spent 3 years avoiding. "It is different," Frances said, "when you choose it." Alara looked at her sister's profile. "Is it?" Frances turned back. Her face was honest, in a way it rarely was in ordinary social settings, stripped of the particular surface finish that county life required. "Yes," she said, "it is. I did not choose what I have. You know that. I do not regret my children, and I do not resent George, who is not a bad man, but I did not choose the shape of this life, and I am aware of it every single day, not painfully, just aware." She paused. "You are being offered a choice, a real one it sounds like. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything." Alara sat with this. Outside, the October morning was doing what October does, going gray and honest, the landscape stripped of everything decorative and simply itself. "I am afraid," she said, "of trusting incorrectly, of building something on a foundation that appears solid and turns out not to be." "Yes," Frances said, "that is always the risk. There is no information that removes that risk." "I know." "You will not get certainty," Frances said. "What you can get is honesty. What you have described sounds like someone who is being honest with you. That is rarer than certainty, and, in the long run, more useful." They sat in the morning room and drank their tea and did not say anything for a few minutes that needed to be said, and then they talked about Frances's children, and about the state of the kitchen garden, and about a book Alara had mentioned in a recent letter, and the visit became, eventually, the kind of ordinary visit that sisters have when they are in the vicinity of something important, but have said what needs to be said about it, and do not need to keep pulling it into the open. When Alara left, Frances came to the door with her. "Alara," she said. Alara stopped. "Whatever you decide," Frances said. "I am glad you walked here." Alara looked at her sister. Then she said, "So am I." She walked the 2 miles home in the October morning and arrived at the estate with her mind considerably clearer than it had been when she left, and her coat damp at the shoulders, from the rain that had started on the last half-mile, and a specific kind of calm in her chest, that was not the calm of having resolved anything, but the calm of having been genuinely heard by someone who knew you, and was still there when you finished talking. She went upstairs. She changed her coat. She sat at her desk. She thought about what Frances had said. Honesty is rarer than certainty, and, in the long run, more useful. She thought about the Duke and what she had observed of him in 3 weeks of careful attention. She thought about the drawing room conversation and what it had cost him to say what he had said, the specific exposure of naming what you intend before you know how it will be received. She thought about the railway meetings and the way he had dealt with her father and the way he had spoken to Edmund Crane about the Eastern drainage documents and the note he had sent to Clara Finch before he spoke to anyone about anything. She thought about all of it. Then she sat at her desk and began to write the letter that would tell him she was ready to speak with him properly, on her terms, about what the future might look like. She wrote it 3 times before the version was right. Not because she could not find the words. She always found the words. But because this particular set of words needed to be exactly right, needed to say precisely what she meant, and no more and no less, and she revised until it was what she intended. She sent it out with the afternoon post. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at her desk and felt the specific weight of a decision made and a letter sent and a future now in motion that could not be unmade. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had done in 3 years. The lamp burned on the desk. Outside, the October afternoon was going dark early, the way October afternoons do. She let it. The announcement appeared in the County Gazette on a Monday, and Alara did not find out about it until Tuesday morning. Mary brought the paper as she always did, folded to the page her father had circled, and read the relevant items aloud while Alara sat in the breakfast room and listened. The County Gazette contained a short paragraph toward the bottom of the social notices that announced, in the careful language of such paragraphs, that Miss Alara Voss, beloved daughter of Mr. Gerald Voss of Aldermere, had experienced a remarkable recovery of her sight and was understood to be in excellent health. It noted, with the particular significance that short paragraphs in county gazettes carry when they choose to carry it, that Duke Callum Ashvale had expressed a personal interest in the welfare of the family during the recent railway negotiations. The rest of the paragraph connected these two facts in a sentence that did not explicitly announce a betrothal, but that left no serious reader in any doubt that a betrothal was being implied. Mary stopped reading. The breakfast room was very quiet. Alara said, "Read it again." Mary read it again. "Thank you," Alara said. "You may go." After Mary left, Alara sat completely still in the breakfast room for a long time. Not in the performance, not in any posture that was designed for anyone else's benefit. Just sitting, with the facts arranging themselves in front of her like pieces on a table that she had not laid out and had not agreed to lay out. Her father had announced her recovery without telling her. Her father had, in the same announcement, implied her connection to the Duke without asking her. Her father had, in one short paragraph in the County Gazette, dismantled 3 years of constructed situation and replaced it with a new one, and had done it in the same way he had tried to hand her to Lord Harwick 3 years ago, as a transaction that required her presence but not her consent. She stood up from the breakfast table and walked to her father's study. She knocked. She went in without waiting for a response. He was at his desk, reading a letter. He looked up with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this conversation, and had decided in advance how to manage it. "You should have told me," she said. "I was going to speak to you this morning," he said. "You should have told me before," she said. "Before the Gazette, before any of it." He set the letter down. He folded his hands on the desk with the careful patience of someone arranging themselves for an argument they believe they are going to win. "The Duke expressed his intentions to me last week," he said. "His intentions are honorable, and the match is an excellent one. I saw no reason to delay the announcement." "His intentions," she said. "What intentions?" "He spoke to me about the possibility of a formal arrangement," her father said. "He was clear that he held you in high regard. He asked about the family's position, and I gave him an honest account. The conversation was, overall, a very positive one." She heard every word of this. She heard what was said, and she heard, underneath it, the same accounting she had heard 3 years ago, the weighing of assets and liabilities, the calculation of what the match could resolve, the positioning of her as the element in the equation that completed it. "Did he propose?" she said. Her father's eyes shifted slightly. "He indicated his intentions," he said again. "That is not a proposal," she said. "A man indicating intentions to a woman's father is not a proposal. A proposal is made to the woman." "Alara," he said, with the particular tone that had always meant she was being managed toward something. "Did he say he intended to propose to me?" she said. "In those words? Did he say he intended to speak to me about this before anything was announced?" A brief silence. Her father picked up the letter, put it down. "The announcement was appropriate given the circumstances," he said. She understood. The Duke had expressed interest. He had, perhaps, done so more generally, more carefully, with more conditions than her father had chosen to register. And her father, seeing in that expression of interest an opportunity to close an account that had been sitting open and expensive for 3 years, had moved faster than any of the parties involved had authorized. This was her father. This was exactly and completely her father. She turned and left the study. She went to her room. She sat at her writing desk for 20 minutes and did not write anything. Then she stood up and picked up her coat and her cane. and told Mary, when she met her in the hallway, that she was going for a walk and did not need company. She did not go to the south field. She went to the lane road that ran from the estate toward the village, and she walked it quickly and without any performance, because there was no one to perform for at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning in late October on this particular lane. She walked fast, the way she walked when she needed to think through something that required the movement of her body to organize properly. What she arrived at the end of 1.5 miles of walking, was a set of facts she needed to hold clearly. 1. She did not know what the Duke had actually said to her father. She had the Gazette paragraph and her father's account, and neither of those was reliable as a precise record of what had been said and intended. 2. She did not know, with certainty, what the Duke intended toward her. She knew what she thought. She thought he was an honest person. She thought that what he had told her in the drawing room, that he was still considering what the situation amounted to, that he would not dismantle what she had built, that she deserved to hear things from someone not invested in her not hearing them, was exactly what it had appeared to be. But she did not know. She had known him for 3 weeks. 3. Whatever the Duke had or had not said or intended, the Gazette paragraph now existed. It had been read by everyone in the county who read the Gazette, which was everyone who mattered for the purposes of what happened next. The performance was over whether she chose to end it or not. Her recovery had been announced. Her name had been connected to the Duke's in print. The situation her father had been patient enough to hold in reserve for 3 years had now been publicly reopened. She stopped on the lane. She stood in the road and looked at the fields around her. The brown autumn fields, the bare hedgerows, the sky that was thinking about rain. She had to go back to the estate. She had to find out what the Duke had actually said to her father. She had to find out what he intended. She had to decide, based on what she found out, what she intended. And she had to do all of this as herself, not as the performance, not as the carefully constructed figure who had moved through 3 years of this county's social life, with the specific, invisible discipline of someone who had decided that survival was the first priority. As herself, the person who had written the essays and the monograph and the correspondence, and who had walked the Southfield Railway property with a man who had seen through the performance and left it standing, and who had told him the truth about her mother, and what the room meant, and what she was working toward. She turned around and walked back to the estate. She sent a message to the Pemberton house, addressed to the Duke of Ashvale, with the information that she would be grateful for a conversation at his convenience, and that the matter was of some importance. He arrived at the estate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She met him in the sitting room. She was not in the performance. She was simply there, in the room, in the ordinary way, standing near the window when he came in, turning to look at him when he entered, the way a person turns to look when someone enters the room. He looked at her. His expression registered what he was seeing, not the performance, just her, and then settled. "You saw the Gazette," he said. "This morning," she said. "Sit down, please." He sat. She sat across from him. "Tell me exactly what you said to my father," she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting. He had spoken to her father at the close of the final railway meeting, 3 days prior, and had said that he had come to have considerable regard for the Voss family, and specifically for Miss Voss, and that he intended, at the appropriate time, to speak with her directly about the possibility of a future arrangement. He had been clear that the word at the appropriate time meant after he had spoken with her, and that the speaking with her was the necessary first step, not the announcement. He had not given her father authorization to publish anything. He had not proposed. He had expressed a direction of interest and assumed, apparently incorrectly, that the man across the desk from him would understand the sequence of steps that such an expression implied. When he finished, there was a silence. "He moved faster than you intended," she said. "Yes," the Duke said. "He does that," she said, "when he sees an opening." Another silence. The fire was low. The afternoon light was going toward gray. "What do you intend now?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She held his gaze. The room was very quiet. 3 years of deception, of performance, of daily discipline, and loneliness, and the strange hidden richness of it. 3 years of building something inside a structure that could not last, knowing it could not last, and choosing it anyway, because it was the only choice available. And now the structure was gone, knocked over by a short paragraph in the County Gazette, and she was sitting in the room without it for the first time. She felt stripped, not in an unpleasant way, in the way that something feels when a weight you have been carrying for a long time is suddenly not there, and your body has not yet learned what it is without the weight. "I want to keep writing," she said. "I want E. Moreland to be published under a real name eventually. I want to complete the second monograph I have begun. I want a life in which those things are possible, not tolerated, not humored, not permitted, as long as they stay quiet and do not inconvenience anything else. Possible, real, part of what my life actually is." He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer reassurance or performance of any kind. He listened the way he listened to everything, fully, with the patience of someone who understands that interrupting a person who is saying something true is never worth whatever it saves in time. She continued. "I am not opposed to marriage," she said. "I am opposed to the kind of marriage my father has been arranging, the kind in which I am the settlement, and the other party is the account being closed. I am opposed to being managed. I am opposed to a life organized around someone else's requirements and called a partnership." She paused. "If what you are considering is that kind of arrangement," she said, "then I am grateful for your discretion in the matter of the deception, and I am grateful for the conversations we have had, and I would ask you to please tell my father the arrangement is not proceeding, and I will deal with the consequences of that." He had been very still throughout all of this. He was still now. "What I am considering," he said, "is not that kind of arrangement." She looked at him. "I should tell you," he said, "that before I spoke to your father, I had already sent a letter to Clara Finch. I found her address through the Quarterly Journal. I told her that I had reason to believe E. Moreland's true identity, that I was not going to disclose it without permission, and that I wanted to know, from someone who knew the work and had known the author, whether the author was someone I should trust." Alara was very still. "What did she say?" she asked. "She said that E. Moreland was the most genuinely honest writer she had worked with in 20 years, he said. "She said that honest meant honest in the full sense, that the ideas were honest, the thinking was honest, and the person behind the thinking was honest, even when the thinking was being done under circumstances that most people would not have managed." He paused. "She also said," he continued, "that if I was the person asking the question, I should be very careful, because E. Moreland had earned something real and was in a fragile situation and did not need someone entering her life who thought they were doing her a favor." He looked at her directly. "I have been trying to be careful," he said. "I am not certain I have been careful enough." She sat with everything he had said. The fire had gone lower. The room had darkened around them, the gray afternoon coming in through the windows. She had not told Mary to bring lamps. She reached up and lit the lamp on the table beside her chair. It was a simple thing, a practical thing, the kind of thing a person does when the room gets dark. She did it without thinking. Then she realized she had done it, in front of him, without any calculation. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything about it. He simply waited, in the warm lamplight, for whatever came next. "I need to know," she said, "that if I choose this, if I choose to speak to you honestly about a future, it is because I have chosen it, not because my father arranged it, not because the Gazette has made it necessary, not because you are the best available option given the current state of things." She held his gaze. "I need it to be a choice that I make with open eyes." "Yes," he said. "Give me time," she said. "I have said that I will," he said. And then, very carefully, "But I want you to know, while you are taking that time, that what I am considering is not a favor and not an arrangement. I am considering whether two people who have each spent a significant period of their lives managing something difficult alone might do better to stop doing that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I will think about that." He stood. He thanked her for the conversation. He moved toward the door. "Your Grace," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter to Clara Finch, for the careful way you did that." He looked at her for a moment. "She was right to warn me," he said. "I am aware of that." He left. She sat in the lamplight in the sitting room that had been her mother's room first, and heard the front door close and his carriage leave the drive. She sat for a long time. The lamp made a small warm circle of light in the October darkness. She was 30 years old, with no more performance to maintain, and a choice sitting in front of her that was, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely and completely hers. She sat with it. She did not rush. 3 days was not a long time. She had spent 3 years building something piece by piece, and she had spent those 3 days taking it apart in the same methodical way, not recklessly, not in a rush, but with the same careful attention she had given to the construction of it. The first thing she did was write to Clara Finch. She told Clara everything. Not a curated version, not a version shaped for a particular response, but the full account, beginning with the Thursday afternoon, when her father had called her into his study and told her about Lord Harwick, and ending with the sitting-room conversation with the Duke and the lamp she had lit without thinking, and the fact that she now had a choice in front of her, that she needed to see clearly before she could make it. She wrote the letter in the morning and sent it out by the afternoon post. She did not wait for a reply before she continued thinking, but she needed Clara to know. After 3 years of E. Moreland and the careful maintenance of the pen name and the particular intimacy of their correspondence, Clara deserved the full account. The second thing she did was talk to Mary. Not an official conversation. Not a sit-down, I have something to tell you. She found Mary in the upstairs hallway on the second morning, doing what Mary always did in the hallway in the mornings, and she stopped, and she said, quietly and without preamble, "You knew." Mary looked at her. "Yes, Miss Alara," she said, in the careful voice she had used from the beginning, for some time. "Why did you say nothing?" Mary thought about this for a moment. "It was not my place to say something," she said. "And it was also not. I did not think it was something you were doing carelessly. It seemed to me like something a person was doing because they needed to." She paused. "I thought if you needed help, you would ask, and if you did not ask, then you were managing." Alara looked at her. "Were you frightened of being involved?" "Sometimes," Mary said honestly. "But then I thought about what Lord Harwick had been like when he visited, and about your father's study, and the conversations that came through the door on certain evenings. And I thought, well, I thought there were different kinds of frightening." Alara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. For the years of it." Mary said, "Of course, Miss Alara," in the voice she used for things that did not require a great deal of elaboration. The third thing she did was walk the south field alone. She went out on the second morning, early, before the household was fully in motion. She walked the lane road, and then the path along the south field, and she let herself look at everything, really look, with the full and ordinary operation of her eyes, at the color of the sky, and the state of the hedgerows, and the particular quality of light that the county had in late October, which was a stripped and honest light, the light of a landscape that had let everything decorative fall away, and was simply itself. She had missed this. She had not known how much she had missed it, because she had been so thoroughly inside the performance that the deprivation had been part of the furniture of the thing, and she had stopped registering it as deprivation, and just registered it as how things were. She stood at the south field post, the one where she had met the Duke on the Tuesday morning that had changed the shape of the situation, and she looked at the railway embankment, and the fields beyond it, and the sky above them all, and she just stood there in the morning and looked. After a while, she thought about what the Duke had said. Two people who have each spent a significant period of their lives managing something difficult alone might do better to stop doing that. She had turned this sentence over many times in the 3 days since he had said it. She had examined it from every angle she knew how to examine things from. She had looked for the place where it was managing her toward something, where it had a shape underneath it that was different from its surface shape. She had not found that place. She was not naive. She understood that people said things with the best of intentions, and then the intentions and the practice diverged, and that no one could know in advance whether that would happen, and that choosing to trust someone was always a risk that could not be fully calculated. She understood that the Duke was a person she had known for less than a month, and that a month was not enough time to know anything, with the certainty she would prefer to have before making a significant decision. But she had also spent 3 years developing a very fine instrument for detecting the difference between honesty and performance. She had been close to performance constantly for 3 years. She knew what it felt like from the inside, and she was learning, through the specific experience of the conversations with the Duke, what it felt like from the outside when it was absent. When he had told her he had contacted Clara Finch before speaking to her father, something had settled in her. Not because the action was romantic. It was not romantic. It was simply the action of a person who understood, without being told, what mattered and in what order things needed to happen. He had wanted to know who she was from someone who knew her. He had wanted to do that before he committed to anything, because commitment without information is not commitment. It is impulse dressed in good clothes. That was the kind of thinking she recognized. That was, in fact, the kind of thinking she did herself. The morning was getting lighter. She turned and walked back toward the estate. She went to her father's study. He was at his desk when she knocked and entered. He looked at her with the wary attentiveness of a man who had been in the vicinity of several difficult conversations in the past 3 days, and was not entirely certain which one this was going to be. "I am going to speak with the Duke," she said. "Not because you arranged the situation, despite it." Her father said nothing. "I need you to understand the difference," she said. "I am not the piece you are playing on this board. I am not the settlement. Whatever happens from this point forward happens because I have chosen it, not because it resolved your accounts." He looked at her for a long moment. There were several things moving across his face, and she read them in the way she had been reading them for 3 years, with more accuracy than he would have been comfortable knowing. He was frustrated. He was also, underneath the frustration, something she did not expect. He was relieved. The relief was genuine and complicated, and she thought it was the most honest thing she had seen in his face in a very long time. Whatever managing her toward outcomes had cost him, it had cost something. He was relieved that the managing might be over. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She left the study. Clara's reply came on the afternoon of the 3rd day, which was faster than the post usually managed, and suggested that Clara had written back immediately upon receiving the letter. The reply was 4 pages, and it began without any of the formal epistolary niceties that usually opened their correspondence. She wrote, "I have known, in my work, 3 kinds of writers. The kind who write what they know already and call it truth, the kind who write to find out what they think and call it discovery, and the kind who write because the world as it is does not yet contain what they know it should contain, and they have decided to put it there themselves. You are the 3rd kind. I have not told you this before because I thought it might make you self-conscious about the work. I am telling you now because you need to hear it in the context of what you have told me." The letter continued. Clara wrote about the Duke's letter to her, which she said had been careful and specific, and had asked the right questions. She wrote that she had told him what she had said honestly, that E. Moreland was the most genuinely honest writer she had worked with, and that she had also said, not in the letter but here in this one, "I think the honest writer deserves to be able to decide. I think you have not been able to decide anything freely in a very long time. You are able to now. Do not let anyone hurry you." Elara read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the others. She thought for another hour. Then she wrote a note to the Pemberton house, in her own hand, in her own voice, addressed to Duke Callum Ashvale. She told him that she would be walking the Southfield Lane on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, and that she would be glad of company if he found himself in that direction. On Thursday morning, he was at the Southfield post at 8. She was already there when he arrived. She had come early, wanting to be the one who arrived first this time, wanting to be standing in the landscape rather than approaching it, settled and already present when he came. He walked across the field from the direction of the lane road, and he moved the way he always moved, with the practical, unhurried ease of a person who trusts his own pace. He stopped a few feet from her. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that October saves for its last few days, before November arrives and everything softens. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood for a moment in the morning. The fields spread out around them in their autumn colors, brown and gold, and the particular green of the moss on the embankment. Somewhere along the railway line, a bird was doing its morning accounting. She said, "I have thought carefully about what you said in the sitting room." "I know you have," he said. "I want you to understand what I am agreeing to," she said. "I am not agreeing to an arrangement. I am not agreeing to a settlement of accounts. I am agreeing to a conversation, a real one, ongoing, between 2 people who are both telling the truth about what they want and what they will not give up. If the conversation leads somewhere, it leads somewhere. If it does not, it does not. Yes, he said. I will not stop writing, she said. I know. E. Moreland will eventually publish under her real name. Good, he said, and the way he said it. The simple, unqualified good, without any of the hedging or the careful qualification that people put around things when they are approving something they are slightly uncomfortable with. Settled something. I am difficult, she said. I have been told this regularly. I have a tendency to be more direct than people are comfortable with, and to hold positions that others find inconvenient. He looked at her with a quality in his expression that she recognized after a moment as something very close to amusement, though it was the specific amusement of someone who finds something genuinely pleasing rather than funny. I have been told, he said, that I am difficult in exactly the same ways. She looked at him, he looked at her. The morning stood around them in its cold, exact light. She said, then perhaps we will be difficult together, and spare everyone else the trouble. He said, I think that is probably the best outcome available. They walked. The conversation went to practical things first, because they were both people, for whom practical things were a genuine, and not merely a polite interest, and because the railway was still in negotiation, and the eastern section still had its drainage dispute, and these were real matters that required real attention, and were, in a way, the shared ground they had started from. But the practical things gave way, as the lane curved toward the embankment, to other things. She told him about the second monograph, what it was about, where it was going, what she expected to find by the time it was finished. He told her about what the previous 10 years had actually been like, not the professional account he gave in county drawing rooms, but the texture of it, the specific difficulties, and the specific rewards, and the particular kind of tiredness that accumulates when you are functioning at full capacity for too long, without any relief. She listened without offering the kind of comfort that talks over what a person is actually saying. He listened to her, without turning anything into advice. They walked for 2 hours. The morning went from its early cold clarity into something slightly warmer, the sun making a real appearance through the October clouds, the fields changing color as the light changed, the whole landscape doing what it does in those brief late autumn windows, when the weather remembers what it was like to be generous. When they turned back toward the estate, she said, You told me, the first day we spoke honestly, that you came home, partly because the cost had become greater than the return. Yes, he said. Is it different now? She asked. He considered this. The costs are different, he said. They always change. But yes, it is different. She nodded. She looked at the lane ahead of them, the familiar lane she had walked in every mood and weather for 3 years, the lane she knew every stone of. I have spent 3 years, she said, looking at this county from the inside of something that required me to see it differently from how I would have looked at it freely, and I have built things inside that, and I am not sorry about the building, but I am glad to be looking at it clearly now. He said, So am I. The estate came into view at the end of the lane, the south field gate, the kitchen garden wall, the upper windows of the house catching the morning light. She had left from this gate 2 hours ago, and it looked the same as it had looked when she left, and it was entirely different. She stopped at the gate. She said, I am going to tell my father today that I agree to a formal proposal, on the condition that the proposal is made to me and not on my behalf, and that it is made after we have spoken more. More than this, more honestly than we perhaps have been, with specific terms about what both our lives will actually look like. Yes, he said. And I am going to write to Clara Finch today, she said, and tell her that E. Moreland intends to publish the second monograph under her real name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What is her real name? She looked at him. Alara Voss, she said, for now. He held her gaze for a moment and said nothing. There was nothing he needed to say about that. She went inside. She did not go immediately to her father's study. She went first to her room, to her writing desk, to the drawer where her mother's journals and Clara's letters and her own manuscripts sat together. She opened the drawer and looked at what was inside, all the things that had been built, all the evidence of the work. She sat down and she wrote. Not a letter, not an essay, just the beginning of the new thing, the second monograph, which was about what happens after the performance. What happens when the thing you have been sustaining in secret is brought into the open, what it costs, and what it gives back, and what it becomes when it is finally allowed to be itself. She wrote 3 pages, then she stopped and read them. They were very good, sharper than the first monograph, more personal in the specific way that honest things become more personal when honesty is the point rather than the vehicle. She could see where it was going, and she could see that it would take months, and she was glad of that, glad of the months ahead, glad of the work, glad that the room she had fought for and maintained, and inhabited in secret, was now going to be a room with a door she could open. She put the pages in order on the desk. She straightened the edges. She stood up. She went downstairs, to her father's study, and knocked, and went in. She said what she had said she would say, in the words she had planned, without softening them, or adding anything that was there to manage his reception of them. She said she would agree to speak with the Duke about a formal arrangement, on her terms, with her conditions, and that those conditions were not negotiable. Her father listened. He looked older than he had a year ago, she thought. Not diminished, just older, in the way that people get older when they have been carrying something heavier than they can easily carry, and have not been able to put it down. He said, "I was not trying to harm you, with any of it. I know," she said. And then she said, "But trying to not harm someone is not the same as treating them rightly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than the voice he usually used in his study, "No, it is not." She left the study. She went back upstairs. She sat down at her desk and looked at the 3 pages she had written, and then looked out the window at the south field and the lane and the sky above them, and she felt something that she did not immediately have a name for. After a while she found the name. It was simply this: she was where she was, and she knew it, and she was not pretending to be anywhere else. She picked up her pen and continued. The second monograph was published 4 years later, under the name Elara Ashvale. It was reviewed, in the quarterly journal to which she had been contributing for 5 years, in a piece written by Clara Finch, who described the work as a document of extraordinary honesty about what it means to build a life deliberately, and to know, when you have built it, what the building cost, and what it produced, and why both of those things matter. The marriage, which had taken place in the spring, as the county had predicted and as no one had entirely understood, was described by those who knew them best, Clara, Dr. Moore, Francis, Mary, as something for which the county had no existing category. Not a love match in the conventional sense, though there was genuine love in it. Not a practical arrangement, though it was practically excellent. It was something more specific than either. 2 people who had each, separately, done the hard work of knowing what they actually needed, and had been honest enough to name it, and had found, in the naming, that what they needed was not incompatible. The second monograph's dedication read as follows: To my mother, who started it, to E. Moreland, who kept it going, to the room, and what was built in it. Nothing else, no further explanation. The readers who needed to understand it did. The readers who did not need to understand it found other things in the book to hold on to, and those things were there too, because the book was built honestly, and honest things have room in them for more than one kind of truth. Elara Ashvale kept writing for the next 30 years. She published 7 more books. She co-founded, with Clara Finch, a small press dedicated to work that other publishers found inconvenient. She walked the Southfield Lane most mornings, in good weather, and thought about whatever she was currently thinking about, and came back to her desk with the particular clarity that comes from air and movement and enough time to let the mind do what the mind does when no one is requiring it to do anything else. She never pretended to be anything she was not again. She was, as it turned out, enough.